The sun was low when I started up the trail, the kind of late afternoon light that turns everything gold before it fades. I'd done this hike before, Black Ridge Trail, a 10-mile loop through dense forest and rocky outcrops. Not too tough, but enough to make you feel it in your legs by the end. I liked that, like the ache, the way my lungs burned on the steep parts. It was just me, my backpack, and the quiet. I didn't bring a map. I didn't need one. I'd memorized the turns, the landmarks, the big oak with the split trunk at mile 2, the stream you cross at mile 4. I knew where the trail got narrow, where the rocks got loose. I wasn't worried. The first hour was easy. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Birds flitted between branches, their calls sharp in the stillness. My boots crunched over dry leaves, the sound steady, familiar. I kept a good pace, not too fast, not too slow, just moving. Then the light started to go. It happened quicker than I expected. 1 minute, the trees were bathed in orange. The next, the shadows stretched long and the air got colder. I checked my watch. I should have been further along by now. The trail was taking longer than I remembered. No big deal. I had a flashlight. I wasn't scared of the dark. But then the trail changed. It wasn't sudden, just a slow shift, like the woods were closing in. The path got thinner, the underbrush thicker. Branches scraped my arms as I pushed through. I stopped, looked around. This wasn't right. The landmarks were gone. No split oak, no stream. Just trees, endless trees, all looking the same. I turned back, or tried to. The trail behind me didn't look like the one I'd come from. The ground was rougher, the trees denser. My chest tightened. I wasn't lost. Couldn't be lost. I knew this place. I kept walking, faster now. My breath came short, my pulse loud in my ears. The forest didn't care. It just got darker, quieter. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own footsteps, my own breathing. Then I saw it, a shape up ahead, not moving, just standing there between the trees. I froze. My skin prickled. It was too tall to be a person, too still to be an animal. I couldn't make out details, just a silhouette, black against the fading light. I didn't move. It didn't either. Then slowly it turned its head. I ran. I didn't think, just bolted, crashing through branches, my lungs burning. I didn't look back. Couldn't. My foot caught on a root and I went down hard, my knee slamming into rock. Pain shot up my leg, but I scrambled up, kept going. The trees thinned. Suddenly, I was out in the open on a rocky slope. The sky was dark now, stars starting to show. Below me, lights. A road. A town. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone. No service. But it didn't matter. I was out. I turned back once, just once. The ridge loomed behind me, black against the night. Nothing moved. Nothing followed. I walked until I found a gas station, until the lights were bright and the air smelled like gasoline instead of pine. I didn't tell anyone what I saw, didn't know how, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I see it again, standing there, watching, and I wonder if it's still waiting. The trail was supposed to be easy. That's what the park ranger had said. Just a simple loop through the woods, no more than 3 hours. But now, as I stood at the edge of a steep drop, the path crumbling under my boots, I knew something was wrong. I had started early, just after sunrise. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your nose but feels good in your lungs. The trees were thick here, their branches weaving together like fingers, blocking out most of the sky. The only sounds were my own footsteps, the occasional snap of a twig, and the distant call of a bird I didn't recognize. I checked my map again. The trail was marked clearly, a solid blue line cutting through the forest. But the further I walked, the fainter the path became. The dirt turned to moss, then to tangled roots that grabbed at my ankles. I told myself it was fine. Trails get rough sometimes. I just keep moving. Then I saw the first sign. A scrap of fabric, bright red, tied to a low branch. It looked fresh, not weathered by rain or wind. My stomach tightened. People don't mark trails like that unless they're lost. unless they're desperate. I kept walking slower now. The trees seemed to press closer, their shadows stretching long across the ground. My breath came quicker, my pulse thudding in my ears. The air smelled different here, damp and heavy, like wet earth and something else, something metallic. Then I saw the shoe, just one, lying on its side near a fallen log. A hiking boot, scuffed and muddy, the laces still tied. My hands shook as I crouched down. The inside was stained dark, not mud, something thicker. I stood up fast, my heart hammering. I wanted to run, but where? The trail was gone, just trees in every direction, their trunks like prison bars. I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the ground for footprints. Anything. That's when I saw the second marker. Another strip of red fabric, further ahead. And beyond that, a third. Someone had been here before me, someone who didn't make it out. I followed the scraps. I didn't know what else to do. Each one led me deeper, the forest swallowing the daylight. The smell got stronger, iron and rot. My skin prickled. Then I found the clearing. The ground was torn up, like something had been dragged through the dirt. Deep grooves cut into the earth, leading to a pile of leaves and broken branches. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I kicked aside the leaves. Beneath them, a hand, pale, fingers curled like claws. The rest was buried, but I didn't need to see more. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. That's when I heard it. A crack, a footstep, not mine. I spun around. The trees stood silent, watching, but I felt it. Something moving just out of sight. Something close. I ran. Branches whipped at my face, thorns tearing my clothes. I didn't stop, didn't look back. My lungs burned, my legs screaming, but I pushed harder. Then the trail, the real one, wide and clear. I nearly sobbed in relief. I didn't slow down until I hit the parking lot. My car still sitting alone under the gray sky. I locked the doors and drove, fast. At the ranger station, they listened. They searched. They found the body. A hiker missing for weeks. No signs of an animal attack. No natural cause. They never found what did it. I still see that hand in my dreams. Still hear the footsteps behind me. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I swear I catch a flash of red between the trees, marking a new trail, waiting for the next hiker. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees, turning the forest into a maze of dark shapes. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and the map in my pocket felt useless now. I had followed what I thought was a trail, but the deeper I went, the more the trees closed in around me, their branches like twisted fingers reaching out. I stopped to catch my breath, listening. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling of animals. Just the sound of my own breathing, too loud in the stillness. The air smelled damp, thick with the scent of rotting leaves and wet earth. My boots sank slightly into the soft ground with every step, leaving deep prints behind me. I checked my phone again. No signal. The battery was at 18%. I switched it off to save what little power remained, cursing under my breath. Stupid. I should have turned back hours ago. The trail, if it even was a trail, had narrowed to almost nothing, just a faint break in the underbrush where maybe deer had passed through. I pushed forward anyway, because turning back meant admitting I was lost, and that thought was worse than the growing dread in my chest. Then I saw the first sign, a scrap of fabric, torn and faded, caught on a thorny bush, red like dried blood. I reached out, touching it. It was old, frayed at the edges, damp from the air. Someone else had been here. Maybe they got out. I kept walking. The trees grew thicker, their trunks gnarled and twisted, roots rising from the ground like buried bones. The light was fading fast now, the sky turning a deep gray beyond the canopy. I pulled out my flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the gloom, but it didn't reach far. Shadows moved at the edges, just out of sight. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then I heard it. A sound. Not an animal, not the wind, footsteps, not mine. They were slow, deliberate, crunching over twigs and leaves somewhere behind me. I froze, my breath catching. The sound stopped. I turned, shining the light behind me. Nothing, just trees, darkness. I forced myself to keep moving, faster now. My heart hammered against my ribs. The footsteps started again, keeping pace with me. Not running, not getting closer, just following. I picked up speed, my boots slipping on wet leaves. The flashlight beam bounced wildly as I ran, shadows leaping at me from all sides. My lungs burned, branches whipped at my arms, my face. I didn't stop. Then the ground gave way. My foot caught on something, and I fell hard, the flashlight flying from my grip. It hit the ground and rolled, the beam flickering before going out. Darkness. I lay there, gasping, pain shooting up my leg. My ankle throbbed, sprained, maybe broken. I pushed myself up, my hands sinking into cold mud. The footsteps had stopped again. Then I saw it, a figure, standing between the trees, just beyond where the light had been. Tall, still, watching. I scrambled back, my fingers digging into the dirt. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, a shadow in the deeper dark. I reached for the flashlight, my hands shaking. My fingers closed around it. I clicked the switch. Nothing. I hit it against my palm. Once, twice. It flickered. The beam came back, weak but there. I swung it toward the figure. Empty. Just trees. I didn't wait. I forced myself up, ignoring the pain in my ankle, and ran. I don't know how long I ran. Branches tore at my clothes. My breath came in ragged gasps. My legs screamed at me to stop, but I couldn't. Then light. Not my flashlight. Real light. Pale and dim, but there. A break in the trees. I stumbled toward it, my vision blurring. The trees thinned. The ground sloped downward. And then I was out, collapsing onto gravel, my hands scraping against rocks. A road. An actual road. I sobbed in relief, dragging myself forward. My ankle was swollen now, my clothes torn and filthy. But I was out. A truck appeared in the distance, headlights cutting through the dark. I waved my arms, shouting, my voice raw. The truck slowed, then stopped. The door opened. A man stepped out, his face lined with concern. Jesus, kid, you okay? I couldn't speak, just nodded, shaking. He helped me into the truck, the cab warm and bright. As we drove away, I looked back at the forest. Something moved at the tree line, a shadow slipping back into the dark. Then it was gone. The man didn't see it. He kept driving, talking about taking me to the nearest town, about calling someone for me. I barely heard him. I was safe now, but I knew one thing. I was never going back into those woods. I thought it would be an easy hike, just a few hours through the woods, a quick loop around Black Pine Ridge, and back before sunset. The map said 6 miles, marked with clear blue blazes on the trees. I'd done harder trails before, but the moment I stepped off the main path to take a leak, everything changed. The woods swallowed me whole. At first, I didn't panic. I'd only gone 10 steps off the trail, maybe 20. I zipped up, turned around, and expected to see the familiar dirt path right where I left it. But the trees looked different now. The sunlight didn't cut through the branches the same way. The air was heavier, damp, like the forest had exhaled and trapped me inside. I walked in what I thought was the right direction. My boots crunched over dead leaves, twigs snapping under my weight. The sounds were too loud. Every step echoed, like the woods were mocking me. I checked my phone, no signal. The GPS just spun in circles, useless. I tried to stay calm. People get turned around all the time. I just had to retrace my steps. But the ground sloped downward when it should have been flat. The trees grew thicker, their trunks twisted and gnarled, roots bulging from the soil like veins. I kept walking, faster now, my breath coming in short bursts. The sun was sinking, shadows stretching long and thin across the forest floor. I checked my watch. 2 hours had passed. 2 hours, and I should have been back at the trailhead by now. Something moved in the brush ahead. I froze. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But the rustling didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate. Not an animal running, something moving with purpose. My skin prickled. I took a step back, and a branch cracked under my foot. The noise in the bushes stopped. Silence. Then a low, wet sound, like something dragging itself over the ground. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran. Branches whipped at my arms, my face. My lungs burned. I didn't look back. The forest blurred around me, a mess of greens and browns, the ground uneven, trying to trip me. My foot caught on a root and I went down hard. Pain shot through my knee. I scrambled up, tasting blood where I'd bitten my tongue. The dragging sound was closer now. I didn't scream. Screaming meant I was prey. I kept moving, limping, my heart slamming against my ribs. The trees thinned suddenly, and I stumbled into a clearing. A cabin stood in the center, old and rotting, its roof sagging. The door hung open, darkness pooling inside. I didn't want to go in, but the dragging sound was right behind me. I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something worse, something metallic. The floorboards groaned under my weight. The door swung shut behind me with a soft click. No, I grabbed the handle. It didn't move. Locked. We're stuck. I yanked at it, my fingers slipping. Outside, the dragging sound stopped right at the door. Then knocking. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the wood. I backed away. The cabin was small. 1 room with a rusted stove in the corner. A broken chair. A mattress stained with something dark. A single window covered in grime let in just enough light to see the shapes of things. The knocking came again. I wasn't alone. Something was in here with me. I felt it before I saw it. A shift in the air, a presence. I turned slowly. In the far corner, where the shadows were deepest, a figure stood. Tall, too tall, its limbs stretched and wrong. His head tilted, watching me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The thing took a step forward. I bolted for the window. My shoulder hit the glass and it shattered. Cold air rushed in as I tumbled outside, landing in the dirt. I didn't stop. I ran until my legs gave out, until the trees thinned and the sky opened up above me. The trail. I was back on the trail. I didn't look back. I followed the blue blazes, my breath ragged, my body shaking. The parking lot came into view, my car sitting alone under the dying light. I got in, locked the doors, and drove. I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear it. 3 slow knocks against the door. And I know, it's waiting for me to answer. The morning had started like any other. Cool, quiet. The kind of dawn that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I had packed my bag the night before. Water, protein bars, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a knife. Just the basics. The trail wasn't supposed to be hard. 6 miles in, 6 miles out. A loop through dense woods, leading to a ridge with a view that was supposed to be worth the climb. I parked at the trailhead, my tires crunching over gravel. The lot was empty. That should have been my first warning. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Birds chirped somewhere high above, but the trees were so thick I couldn't see them. The path was narrow, barely more than a deer trail in places, but the markers were clear. Blue paint on the trunks every 50 feet or so. I checked my watch. 7:30 a.m. Plenty of time to make it to the ridge and back before dark. The first hour passed without trouble. The woods were alive with small sounds, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. Squirrels darted across the path. The sun climbed higher, but the canopy was so dense that only thin shafts of light made it through. The air stayed cool, almost clammy. Then the markers stopped. I didn't notice at first. I was too busy watching my footing, stepping over roots and rocks. But when I finally looked up, searching for the next blue slash, there was nothing, just bark. I turned, scanning the trees behind me. The last marker had been maybe 10 minutes back. Had I taken a wrong turn? I pulled out my phone. No signal. Not surprising. I had a map in my bag, but the trail was supposed to be straightforward. I kept walking, slower now, looking for any sign of the path. The ground sloped upward, the trees pressing closer. The air felt heavier. Then I saw it, a break in the trees. Not the trail, but something else. A narrow gap, like something had forced its way through. The branches were bent, snapped in places. Too big for a deer, too messy for a person. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I stepped through the gap, my boots sinking into soft earth. The ground was torn up, like something had been dragged. There were marks, deep grooves in the dirt. Claw marks? No, that was stupid. Probably just an animal. A bear, maybe. The woods were too quiet now. No birds, no squirrels, just the sound of my own breathing. I kept walking. The trees thinned suddenly, opening into a small clearing. And that's when I saw it. A tent, or what was left of one. The fabric was shredded. The poles snapped. A backpack lay torn open, its contents scattered. A water bottle, a mangled granola wrapper, a broken phone, and blood. Dark streaks in the dirt, leading away from the wreckage. My stomach twisted. Someone had been here, recently. I took a step back, my pulse hammering in my throat. Then I heard it, a low, wet sound, a gurgle, like someone struggling to breathe. It came from the trees on the other side of the clearing. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I moved slowly, every muscle tense. The sound grew louder. Then I saw him, a man, or what was left of one. He was propped against a tree, his legs bent at wrong angles. His shirt was soaked in blood, his face pale and slack. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. His chest rose once, twice, then stopped. Dead. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. Something had done this. Something real. Something close. Then I heard the snap of a branch behind me. I didn't turn. I ran. Branches whipped at my arms, my face. My breath came in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going. Just away. Away from the clearing. Away from the blood. The woods blurred around me. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, my knee slamming into rock. Pain shot up my leg, but I forced myself up, kept moving. Then, miraculously, I saw it. A blue marker, the trail. I nearly sobbed in relief. I wasn't lost. I could get out. I followed the markers at a sprint, my lungs burning. The trees began to thin. Sunlight broke through. And then suddenly I was out. The parking lot. My car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. I threw myself inside, slammed it shut, locked it. Only then did I let myself breathe. I sat there for a long time, staring at the woods, waiting for something to emerge. Nothing did. I started the car, drove, didn't stop until I was back on the highway, surrounded by other cars, other people. I never went back. A week later, I saw the news. A hiker had gone missing in those woods. They found his body. Mauled, the report said. Bear attack. But I knew. Bears don't leave claw marks like that. Bears don't watch you from the trees. The sun was high when I started, the kind of bright that makes everything sharp and clear. The trail was familiar. I'd walked it a dozen times before. Just a loop through the woods, nothing too wild. 3 hours in, 3 hours out. Easy. But something felt off today. First, it was small things. The way the wind didn't move the trees right. The silence. No birds, no rustling. Just my boots crunching on dry leaves. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the animals were hiding. Maybe the heat was keeping them quiet. Then I saw the footprints. Not mine. Too big, too deep, like whoever made them was heavy. And fresh. The edges were sharp. No rain or wind to blur them. My stomach tightened. I wasn't alone out here. I kept walking faster now. The trees closed in, branches scraping like fingers. My breath came quick, my heart loud in my ears. Every shadow looked wrong. Every sound, a snapped twig, a distant creak, made my skin crawl. Then I heard it. A step, not mine. Behind me, I didn't turn. I didn't want to see. My legs moved on their own, almost running. The road was barely a road anymore, just a narrow strip of dirt cutting through the trees, riddled with potholes and patches of mud from last night's rain. My headlights flickered over the uneven ground, the beams catching the eyes of something small and quick darting into the underbrush. A rabbit, maybe, or a fox. The engine groaned as I pressed the gas, the tires slipping for a second before gripping again. The GPS had stopped working half an hour ago, but the directions were simple enough. Follow this path until it ends at the cabin. I shouldn't have come here alone. The thought had been gnawing at me since I left the highway, but I pushed it down. It was just a weekend getaway, a chance to clear my head. No phone signal, no emails, no noise. Just me, the woods, and the old hunting cabin my uncle had left me in his will. I'd never even seen the place before, just a few faded photos of a wooden structure with a slanted roof, tucked between pines. The trees closed in tighter, branches scraping against the sides of the car like fingernails. I rolled down the window, letting in the damp, earthy smell of the forest. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of pine and something else. Something faintly sour, like wet leaves left to rot. Then the cabin appeared. It was smaller than I expected, hunched in a clearing like an animal waiting to pounce. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagging in the middle. The front porch had a single rocking chair, its paint peeling, the wood beneath cracked and splintered. A rusted metal bucket sat beside it, half full of rainwater. I turned off the engine. The silence rushed in, pressing against my ears. No birds, no wind, just the slow drip of water from the trees. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and stepped out. The ground was soft underfoot, the mud sucking at my boots. The key was where my uncle said it would be, under a loose floorboard near the steps. I crouched, fingers digging into the damp wood until I felt the cold metal. The lock was stiff, but after a few tries, the door creaked open. The inside smelled like mildew and old smoke. A single room with a wood stove in the corner, a narrow bed against the wall, and a table with a kerosene lamp. Dust floated in the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. I dropped my bag on the bed, the springs groaning under the weight. I should have checked the place first, but I was tired, and the drive had been longer than I thought. So I lit the lamp, ate a cold sandwich from my bag, and lay down. The mattress was thin, the blanket scratchy. Outside, the trees rustled, branches tapping against the roof. I closed my eyes. Something woke me, a sound, not the wind, not the trees, something else. A scrape like wood dragging over wood. I sat up, heart hammering. The lamp had burned out, leaving the room in near total darkness. The only light came from the moon, casting long, jagged shadows through the window. I held my breath, listened. There it was again. Not from outside, from inside, under the floor. I swung my legs off the bed, my bare feet hitting the cold wood. The sound stopped. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just the house settling. Then it came again. A slow, deliberate scrape, like something moving. I grabbed the lamp, fumbling with the matches until the flame flickered to life. The light wavered, throwing shaky shadows across the walls. I knelt, pressing my ear to the floor. Silence. Then, a thump, directly beneath me. My breath caught. There wasn't supposed to be anything under the cabin. No basement, no crawl space, just dirt. I stood, backing toward the door. The scraping came again, louder now, faster, like something digging, clawing. I didn't wait. I ran. The door slammed behind me as I bolted into the night. The cold air burned my lungs, my feet slipping in the mud. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I reached the car. The engine roared to life, tires spinning as I reversed, the headlights sweeping over the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. The front porch. The rocking chair was moving, not from the wind. There was no wind. It was rocking, slowly, deliberately, like someone had just stood up from it. I slammed the car into gear and didn't stop driving until the trees were far behind me. I never went back, but sometimes, When I'm alone at night, I hear it again, the scrape of wood against wood, and I wonder what's under my floor. I set out on the trail around 8:30 in the morning, the sun already starting to climb high above the trees, casting a warm, golden light over the landscape. The trail I had chosen was one of the quieter ones, far off the beaten path. I had been hiking for years, so the solitude didn't bother me. In fact, I preferred it. The idea of being out there, away from the noise of the world, with only the sounds of nature to keep me company, was exactly what I needed. The air was cool, the kind of crisp freshness that only mornings in the forest can bring. I adjusted my backpack, making sure my water bottle and snacks were within easy reach. The path was narrow, surrounded by thick, green vegetation on either side. Trees towered overhead, their leaves just beginning to turn color, a patchwork of greens, yellows, and reds. The undergrowth was thick with ferns and shrubs, but I had hiked this trail before. It wasn't particularly difficult, but it was a steady climb winding up the mountain, and I liked it for the challenge. As I walked, I could hear the crunch of gravel and dry leaves beneath my boots. It was the kind of sound that made you feel alone in the world, but also strangely peaceful. I breathed in the cool, earthy smell of the forest, the scent of pine and damp soil. The occasional bird call broke the silence, but otherwise, it was just me and the wilderness. The trail curved to the left, and I paused for a moment to take in the view. The valley stretched out below me, a patchwork of fields and distant roads, the mountains rising sharply on all sides. The air was still, and the view was clear, not a cloud in the sky. I smiled to myself, taking in the tranquility. This was why I hiked, this moment of solitude and peace, where the only thing that mattered was putting one foot in front of the other and enjoying the quiet. But then, just as I was about to continue, something caught my eye. A flicker of movement in the distance down the trail where the path curved out of sight. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, but as I stared, the figure didn't move the way a person would. It was more like a shadow, shifting and flickering in the sunlight. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, but whatever it was, it didn't seem to belong. I stood there for a few moments, heart starting to beat faster, trying to convince myself that I was just seeing things. It was probably a trick of the light or a tree moving in the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Reluctantly, I decided to keep moving. The trail ahead was still clear, and I didn't want to overthink things. The last thing I wanted was to let my mind get the best of me, especially on a solo hike like this. I pushed forward, though my steps felt heavier now, more deliberate. As I continued up the path, the woods seemed to grow quieter, the sounds of birds and wind rustling the leaves fading into a strange, unnatural silence. I hadn't noticed it at first, but now I realized that the usual hum of life in the forest had disappeared. It was unsettling, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The only noise was the crunch of my boots and the occasional drip of water from the leaves overhead. But that was it. No wind, no animals, nothing. The further I went, the more I noticed the silence pressing in around me, thick and oppressive. I tried to shake off the unease. It wasn't uncommon for the forest to feel still sometimes, especially when you got high enough on the mountain, but this felt different. I couldn't put my finger on why, but there was something about it that felt wrong. A sudden rustling in the underbrush caught my attention. I froze, heart racing again, and looked around. Nothing, just a few branches swaying slightly, but no movement. The silence was back in full force. I took a deep breath and continued on, but my senses were heightened now, every rustle and creak of the forest making my skin crawl. The trail began to narrow, and the trees grew thicker, their branches tangling overhead, casting long shadows across the path. It felt like the walls of the forest were closing in, the air growing heavier with each step I took. The further I went, the more I felt as though I was being watched. It was an irrational thought, but it kept creeping into my mind. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling didn't fade. Then I heard it, a soft sound, almost like a whisper. I stopped dead in my tracks, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper didn't come again, but the air around me felt charged, as though something unseen was lurking just out of sight. I stood there for a long moment trying to steady my breathing. This was crazy. There was no reason to be scared. It was just the forest, nothing more. But still, I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. I turned back to look down the trail, but there was no sign of anything unusual. Just the same empty path, the same trees, the same silence. I decided it was best to keep moving. My mind was playing tricks on me, I was sure of it. But as I took a step forward, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The trail was no longer the same as I remembered it. The path, which had once been clear and well-maintained, was now overgrown with thick weeds and vines. It wasn't just a small change. This was drastic. The trail had been abandoned for years, and I hadn't even realized it. I knelt down, brushing away some of the weeds to see if the trail continued beneath them, but it was hard to tell. The sense of unease grew stronger, and my breath came faster as the realization hit me. I had taken the wrong path. I cursed under my breath, standing up quickly. I should have noticed sooner, but now I was completely off track, and I had no idea where the main trail was. I scanned the area, but everything around me looked the same. The trees, the rocks, the dense undergrowth, nothing looked familiar. Panic started to creep in. The isolation of the forest, once so comforting, now felt suffocating. I had no phone signal, no way to call for help. I had no map with me, and the faint trail I had followed seemed to disappear into the wilderness, swallowed by the overgrowth. I felt like I was losing my bearings, unable to tell which way was back to the main trail. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Panicking wouldn't help. I had to stay calm and figure out how to get back. I turned around, trying to retrace my steps, but the path was now unfamiliar, twisted in a way I hadn't noticed before. It was like the forest itself was shifting, changing around me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my palms sweaty. The more I tried to find the trail, the more disoriented I became. Every direction I looked seemed to lead to the same thick trees and tangled vines. The whispering sound was back now, faint but persistent, as though the forest itself was alive, watching me. That's when I saw it. A break in the trees, a small clearing just ahead. I rushed toward it, hoping to find a way out. But as I stepped into the clearing, my breath caught in my throat. The forest on the other side of the clearing was different. The trees were twisted, their bark dark and gnarled, and there was an unnatural stillness to the air. It felt wrong, like stepping into a different world altogether. I turned around quickly, trying to find my way back, but the path I had come from was gone. The trees seemed to have closed in behind me, blocking any way out. I was lost. I didn't panic immediately. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself. I knew what I had to do. I had hiked enough to know that you don't get out of situations like this by losing your head. I had to stay rational, focused. I turned in a circle, looking for any sign of the trail, any marker, anything that could tell me where to go. That's when I heard it again, the soft whispering. It was louder this time, coming from all around me. It wasn't just the wind or the trees. There was something else there, something waiting. I took a step back, my hands shaking as I gripped my backpack straps. I was exhausted, my legs heavy from the climb, but I forced myself to keep moving, to push through the growing sense of dread. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I realized, with a jolt of fear, that it wasn't just the wind. The sound wasn't coming from the trees or the leaves. It was coming from the ground, the very earth beneath my feet. I glanced down at the dirt path, my heart racing. The ground was shifting like something was moving underneath it. The earth was alive. Something was crawling beneath the surface, just out of sight. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to stay still. Panicking would do nothing. I had to think. I had to make it out of here. I turned around once more and saw the clearing again, its twisted trees beckoning. I took a deep breath and moved toward them, trying to ignore the unease that seemed to grow stronger with each step. I had no other choice. Then, just as I reached the clearing's edge, I saw it. A narrow trail leading off into the distance, barely visible through the trees. It wasn't much, but it was a path, a way out. I took a step forward, then another, the whispering fading behind me, the air growing still once more. The path ahead seemed to open up, the trees thinning out. I've been hiking in the woods alone before, but this time felt different. Maybe it was the time of year, late fall, when the air turns crisp and the trees start to shed their leaves, leaving the forest floor covered in a thick, crunchy blanket of orange and brown. The kind of day where the sun's out but barely makes a dent in the cold, and everything around you feels a little too quiet. I had picked a trail I knew well, one that looped through a section of the forest that wasn't too far from home, but far enough that I wouldn't see anyone else for a while. It was a moderate hike, nothing too difficult. I'd hiked it at least a dozen times before. The trail was just a little over 5 miles long, winding through dense woods, crossing streams, and going past some overgrown areas. Usually, I would run into a few people here and there, but today there was no one, not a single soul. The silence was unnerving. As I made my way through the forest, I noticed how empty it felt. It wasn't just the lack of people, but the absence of sound. Birds weren't singing, no rustling of small animals in the brush, just the occasional rustle of the wind in the branches above. My footsteps were loud in my ears, almost too loud for such a quiet place. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I chalked it up to my imagination. I kept walking. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. My phone had no signal out here, and I wasn't carrying any sort of emergency communication device. I had been hiking alone before, but I was never this far out. There was something about the trees closing in on the trail, the way the light flickered through the branches, that made everything feel darker, even though it was still daytime. I tried to ignore the growing discomfort and pressed on. At about the halfway point, I reached a stream that cut across the trail. It wasn't a large stream, more like a creek, but the water moved quickly, its gurgling sound filling the silence. I paused to drink some water, sit on a large rock nearby, and just listen for a moment. The cold air made my breath visible in front of me, and I exhaled deeply, watching the vapor disappear into the woods. That's when I heard it. A faint noise at first, a soft rustling behind me. I turned quickly, but nothing was there. I figured it was just an animal or maybe the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I decided to keep moving. I walked for another mile or so, and the woods seemed to grow denser. The trail was harder to follow now, marked by faded paint on trees and occasional signs that were barely visible. The further I went, the more tangled the underbrush became, the path narrowing, the trees growing closer together. Every step felt deliberate, like I was pushing through the forest rather than walking through it. At one point, I had to climb over a large fallen log, its surface slick with moss. As I pulled myself up, I noticed a strange mark on the bark of a nearby tree. It wasn't anything spectacular, just a deep gouge, like something had scraped it with great force, but it struck me as odd. There was something about the pattern that seemed deliberate, almost too precise for just a random animal. I rubbed the back of my neck, feeling a chill run down my spine, but I shook it off. It was probably just an old tree that had been scratched by a bear or a deer. I pushed on. The trail twisted and turned, and I found myself more and more unsure of where I was. I knew the area, but the further I walked, the less familiar it seemed. I stopped to check my watch, only to realize I had been out here longer than I expected. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting long shadows across the trail. I had wanted to finish the hike in a couple of hours, but now it looked like it might take a little longer. I wasn't lost, but I certainly wasn't as sure of my location as I had been earlier. I pressed forward, but my sense of unease grew. Every crack of a twig or rustle in the brush seemed louder now, every shadow longer. And then I heard it again, that soft rustling sound, but this time it was closer, much closer. I spun around, but again, there was nothing. The forest was still, too still. I told myself I was just tired, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. It wasn't uncommon to feel a bit jumpy in the woods alone, especially when you've been hiking for a few hours without seeing anyone. But then, the feeling didn't go away. It didn't fade like I hoped it would. I continued walking, faster now. The trail had become even more overgrown, and I found myself pushing through thick brush. I wasn't on a marked path anymore. It was more like a game trail now. The trees were too close together, the underbrush too thick. The air felt heavier, pressing against me, and I had the distinct sense that I was being followed. I could almost feel eyes on the back of my neck. I kept my pace steady, but my mind was racing. Was it just an animal? Could it be another hiker? Or was there something else out here? Then, a noise broke the silence. A loud crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. I froze, listening intently. There was no other sound. No rustling, no movement. Just that one loud snap. It was too deliberate to be an animal. At this point, my heart was pounding. The light was fading fast, and I knew I had to make a decision. Go back the way I came or keep moving forward, deeper into the woods. I felt the first stirrings of panic rise in my chest. I didn't want to be out here in the dark, and I definitely didn't want to risk getting lost. I turned around, making my way back in the direction I thought I had come from. But every step felt wrong. Every direction I tried seemed unfamiliar, and the trees now all looked the same. I had walked the trail countless times before, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that I was moving in circles. I stopped again, trying to get my bearings, but there was no sign of the trail, no markers, no familiar landmarks. The forest was swallowing me whole. I could hear the rustling again, but this time it was closer, much closer. I dared not turn around this time. I wasn't sure what I'd see, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. I kept walking faster now. My breath was coming in ragged gasps. My heart was pounding in my ears. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Was I being hunted? Was someone out here with me? Then, just as I was beginning to panic, I saw a light, a small, flickering light off to the side. It was faint, but it was there. I almost couldn't believe it at first. I stumbled toward it, my legs heavy, my thoughts blurred by exhaustion and fear. As I got closer, I realized it was the light from a hiker's headlamp. I wasn't alone. A man stood there holding the light. He was taller than me, wearing a jacket and carrying a heavy backpack. He looked at me with a raised eyebrow, clearly surprised to see me. "Lost?" he asked, his voice calm but with a touch of curiosity. I nodded, too relieved to speak. "Follow me," he said, turning and starting down the path. I didn't hesitate. I followed him, keeping close, letting him lead the way. After a few minutes, I could see more lights ahead, other hikers all moving in the same direction. They were on a guided trail, part of a group that I must have missed earlier. They had been out there longer, and they knew these woods far better than I did. We walked for what felt like an eternity. It wasn't until I saw the clearing ahead and the familiar signpost marking the main trail that I realized I was safe. The group led me out of the woods, and I could feel the tension leave my body, the adrenaline draining out of me with each step. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun was fully set, and the sky was a deep purple, the stars just starting to peek through. I didn't look back as I climbed into my car. I started the engine, and with a sigh of relief, I drove away from the woods. The whole experience had been disorienting, terrifying even, but I was out. I was safe. As I drove down the road, I couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if I hadn't come across that light, if I hadn't stumbled upon the group. How far could I have gone? What would have happened if I had wandered deeper, lost and alone, with no way to get back? The forest had felt like it was closing in on me, and now, sitting in my car with the engine running, I could still feel the weight of it all. I vowed I wouldn't hike alone out there again, not without a map, not without a backup plan. That forest had a way of making you feel small, vulnerable, and alone, and I wasn't about to test its boundaries again. But at least for now, I was safe. The sun was just starting to rise when I parked my car at the trailhead. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your fingers and makes your breath fog up in front of you. I zipped up my jacket, adjusted my backpack, and took one last look at the empty parking lot. I was the only one here. That should have been my first warning. The trail was narrow, barely more than a dirt path winding through thick trees. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots crunching on dry twigs. I kept walking, telling myself it was just early, that the animals weren't awake yet. But the deeper I went, the heavier the silence became. I checked my phone, no signal. Not unusual for these woods, but still, it made my stomach tighten. I glanced at my map, making sure I was still on the right path. Everything looked fine, just a straight shot up to the ridge, then loop back down before sunset. Then I saw the first marker, a strip of red cloth tied around a tree branch, faded, frayed at the edges. I frowned. Park rangers usually used bright colors for trail markers, but this looked old, weathered, like it had been there for years. I kept walking. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisting together overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air smelled damp, like rotting leaves and wet earth. My boots sank slightly into the soft ground with each step. Then I saw the second marker, another red cloth. Same tree, same height. I stopped. That wasn't right. I had been walking in a straight line. There was no way I'd circled back. I turned, scanning the trees behind me. Nothing looked familiar, but then again, everything looked the same. Endless trunks, tangled underbrush, shadows stretching between them. I pulled out my compass. The needle spun lazily before settling. North was to my left. The trail was supposed to head northeast. I adjusted my direction and kept moving. The ground sloped upward, the trees thinning slightly as I climbed. My legs burned, my breath coming in short puffs. I wiped sweat from my forehead and kept going. Then I heard it, a snap. Not from me. I froze. Silence. Maybe it was an animal, a deer, a squirrel, but the air felt wrong. Thick, heavy, like something was watching me. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. I took a step forward. Another snap, closer this time. My heart hammered against my ribs. I gripped the strap of my backpack tighter, my fingers trembling. Then I saw it. Between the trees, a figure, standing perfectly still. Tall, too tall, dressed in dark clothes, face hidden in shadow. I didn't move, didn't breathe, it didn't either. Then, in one slow, deliberate motion, it tilted its head. I ran. Branches whipped at my arms, my face. My lungs burned. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The trail disappeared beneath me, the ground uneven, roots snagging at my feet. I stumbled, caught myself, kept running. Then the parking lot. My car was still there, still alone. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly I dropped them. Scooped them up, jammed the right one into the lock, threw myself inside. The engine roared to life. I didn't look back as I peeled out, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. My hands were still shaking when I got home. I locked the door, checked every window, every corner of the house. I never went back to those woods, and I never hiked alone again. The air was crisp, and the sun was starting to set behind the tree line when I realized I had made a mistake. I was alone, deep in the woods, on a trail that wasn't as well marked as I had hoped. It started as a simple day hike, something I had done plenty of times before. I was confident, prepared, and sure I could handle anything the wilderness threw at me. But now, standing in the fading light with no clear path forward, that confidence was starting to crack. The plan had been to complete the loop trail before dark. It wasn't an extremely long hike, maybe 5 or 6 hours round trip, but I had underestimated how difficult the terrain would be. Loose rocks, thick roots, and sharp inclines had slowed me down. My legs were tired, my water supply was running low, and now I wasn't even sure if I was on the right path anymore. I stopped walking and listened. The forest was alive with sounds. Distant bird calls, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. I wasn't afraid, not yet, but a small knot of unease had started to form in my stomach. I pulled out my map, trying to make sense of my location. My phone had no service, of course. I had known it wouldn't, but I still checked out of habit. No GPS, no way to call for help. I took a deep breath and told myself to stay calm. I had to make a decision, keep moving forward or turn back. But which direction was back? The more I looked around, the less familiar everything seemed. The trees looked the same. The path behind me blended into the undergrowth, and suddenly, I realized I wasn't sure which way I had come from. I needed to stay level-headed. I picked a direction, marking a tree with my knife as I passed, and kept walking. The ground was uneven, and I had to focus on every step. The last thing I needed was to twist an ankle out here. As I walked, the light continued to fade, turning the green forest into dark silhouettes against the dim sky. Then, I saw something up ahead, a structure barely visible through the trees. Relief flooded me. Maybe it was an old cabin or a ranger station. Anything was better than wandering aimlessly in the dark. I picked up my pace, moving toward it. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a cabin. It was a fire lookout tower, an old one. The wood was weathered, and some of the steps leading up to it were missing, but the platform at the top still looked sturdy. It was a stroke of luck. I could climb up, get a better view of the surrounding area, and maybe even spot the trail again. Climbing the tower was harder than I expected. Some of the wood was rotten, and I had to test each step before putting my full weight on it. When I finally reached the top, I took a deep breath and looked out. The view was incredible, endless trees stretching out in every direction. The sky now a deep shade of blue with the first stars appearing. But as I scanned the landscape, my stomach sank. There were no signs of a trail, no familiar landmarks, just an endless sea of trees. I was completely lost. I sat down, trying to think. I had enough supplies to last the night, but I hadn't planned on camping. I had no tent, no real shelter, and the temperature was going to drop fast. The tower was my best option. It would keep me off the ground, away from animals, and at least give me some level of security until morning. As darkness fully set in, the sounds of the forest changed. The birds were gone, replaced by the occasional distant howl of a coyote or the rustling of something moving through the underbrush. I forced myself to stay calm. Most animals wouldn't bother me if I didn't bother them. Then I heard something new, something that didn't belong. A crunching sound, footsteps, heavy ones. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't a deer, too slow, too deliberate. My mind raced through the possibilities. A bear? Maybe. A mountain lion? Less likely, but possible. Person? Out here? I crouched low, peering over the edge of the platform. The darkness made it hard to see, but my eyes had adjusted enough to make out movement near the base of the tower. A shadow shifting between the trees. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Then the sound of wood creaking. Something was climbing the tower. Panic surged through me, but I fought to stay quiet. I backed away from the edge, moving toward the opposite side of the platform. My mind was screaming at me to run, to do something, but there was nowhere to go. If I climbed down, I'd be running blind into the woods. If I stayed, I had no idea what was coming up after me. The creaking got louder, closer. I gripped my knife, heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. Then suddenly silence. Nothing moved. No creaking, no footsteps. Just the wind through the trees. I stayed frozen, waiting, listening. The seconds stretched into minutes. I didn't dare breathe too loudly. My body ached from staying so still, but I couldn't risk making a sound. Eventually, exhaustion won. I kept my knife close and forced myself to rest, drifting in and out of uneasy sleep. Every tiny noise jolted me awake, but the sound of footsteps never returned. When the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, I forced myself to move. My muscles were stiff, and my mind was still clouded with fear, but I had to get down. I peered over the edge, scanning the ground below. Nothing. No tracks, no signs that anyone or anything had been there. I climbed down carefully, every creak of the woods setting my nerves on edge. When my feet finally touched the ground, I wasted no time. I picked a direction and walked, determined to find my way back. Hours passed, but eventually I found the trail again. Relief nearly brought me to my knees. I followed it, my body screaming with exhaustion, until I finally reached my car. I never figured out what I heard that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was an animal. Or maybe something or someone was out there watching me. I never went back to that trail, and I never hiked alone again. I checked my pack one last time before zipping it up. Water, food, first aid kit, headlamp, extra socks. Everything seemed good. The sun was already dipping below the trees, painting the sky in pink and orange. I had planned to reach my campsite before dark, but the drive took longer than expected. I debated whether to wait until morning but decided against it. The trail was only about 5 miles, and I had done longer hikes in worse conditions. The first stretch of the trail was easy. The dirt path was well worn, and the trees swayed gently in the evening breeze. I kept a steady pace, adjusting the straps of my backpack to get comfortable. After about 20 minutes, the trail started to climb, winding its way up the side of a hill. My legs burned slightly, but I welcomed the sensation. It meant I was making progress. As the sun disappeared, I pulled out my headlamp and strapped it around my forehead. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow trail ahead. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I was used to hearing crickets or the rustling of small animals, but there was nothing except the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the dirt. About halfway through the hike, I noticed something strange. A few feet off the trail, there was a pile of stones stacked neatly, almost like a marker. That wasn't uncommon. Hikers sometimes built cairns, but something about this one felt off. The rocks were arranged too perfectly, and the pile was taller than normal. I stared at it for a few seconds before shaking off the unease and continuing forward. The trail became rougher. The ground was uneven, with exposed roots and loose rocks. My foot slipped once, and I had to grab a tree trunk to steady myself. That's when I saw it. Another pile of rocks, identical to the first one. Same height, same perfect arrangement. I frowned and glanced back down the trail. I hadn't seen any side paths, which meant someone had gone out of their way to build these. I kept moving, my pace a little faster. The air felt colder now, and the wind had picked up. My headlamp flickered for a second, and I muttered under my breath, tapping the battery case. It steadied, but the momentary darkness had made my heart pound. I was pushing myself too hard. I needed to calm down. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, fresh ones. They were deep, pressed firmly into the dirt, and heading in the same direction as me. I stopped and looked around, scanning the darkness beyond my headlamp's beam. The forest pressed in on all sides, silent and unmoving. The prints weren't mine. They were too large, and the tread pattern didn't match my boots. Someone else had been here recently. I told myself it was fine. Maybe another hiker had passed through earlier. But if that were the case, why hadn't I seen them? I had been on the trail for nearly an hour, and there hadn't been any intersections or side routes. A chill ran up my spine, and I suddenly wished I had waited until morning. I kept walking, forcing myself to focus on my breathing. The trail leveled out briefly before another incline. I glanced down and froze. More footprints, but these were different. The first set had been spaced normally, as if someone was walking at a regular pace. These were erratic, uneven. Some were deep, like whoever made them had been running or stumbling. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My headlamp flickered again. I cursed, tapping the battery pack. Steadied, but the light felt weaker. I needed to keep moving. My campsite wasn't far. Maybe another mile. I could make it. The trees closed in tighter around the trail, their branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers. My breath came in quick bursts now, and my boots crunched against the dirt. Every noise felt louder in the silence. Then something rustled in the bushes to my right. I stopped, holding my breath. The sound was soft, deliberate. Not the wind, not an animal. Something or someone was there. I took a slow step forward, my fingers tightening around the straps of my backpack. The bushes shifted again. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but my voice wouldn't come. I took another step. The noise stopped. I moved quickly now, nearly jogging. My legs burned, but I didn't care. I just wanted to reach my campsite. The footprints kept appearing, but I stopped looking at them. I didn't want to know. The forest felt different now, hostile, like it was watching me. Finally, I saw the clearing ahead. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. My campsite was a mess. My tent was ripped open, my gear strewn across the ground. My sleeping bag was missing. The firewood I had gathered earlier was scattered, as if someone had kicked it apart. I stood frozen, my mind racing. Had an animal done this? No, animals didn't unzip tents. I spun around, my headlamp sweeping the trees. Nothing. The silence was suffocating. My gut told me to leave, to turn around and get out of there. But the thought of hiking back through the dark, back past those footprints, past whatever had been in the bushes, made my stomach churn. I forced myself to move toward my tent, crouching down to inspect the damage. My backpack had been slashed, the fabric cut clean through. Not torn, cut. I dug through my supplies, searching for anything useful. My knife was gone, so was my extra flashlight. My food had been dumped out, trampled into the dirt. A twig snapped somewhere behind me. I whipped around, my breath caught in my throat. My headlamp flickered again, weaker this time. The darkness pressed in, swallowing the edges of my vision. I wasn't alone. Something moved in the trees, a shape just beyond the reach of my light. I didn't wait to see what it was. I grabbed what I could and ran. My boots slammed against the dirt. My lungs burned. The trail blurred past me. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The sound of footsteps pounded behind me. Too fast, too close. My headlamp dimmed further. My legs ached, but I pushed harder, forcing myself forward. The parking lot wasn't far, just a little more. Then suddenly the footsteps stopped. I ran until I saw the faint gleam of my car's headlights reflecting off the trail sign. I burst into the lot, fumbling for my keys with shaking hands. I threw the door open, locked it behind me, and sat there, gasping for breath. My headlamp finally gave out, plunging the world outside into complete darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I drove until I reached the nearest town, pulled into a gas station, and sat there with the doors locked, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My hands were still trembling. I never found out who or what had been out there with me, but I never went back to that trail again. I always loved hiking alone. The quiet, the isolation. It cleared my mind in a way nothing else could. That's why I took time off work to head deep into the mountains, a place I had never been before. The trail was lesser known, something I found through an online forum. People described it as remote and difficult, but with breathtaking views. That was exactly what I was looking for. I started early in the morning. My backpack was heavy with supplies, water, food, a first aid kit, my tent, a sleeping bag, and a small axe just in case. The first few hours were easy. The sun was out, the air was fresh, and I felt great. The trees were thick, their tops swaying in the wind. Birds chirped somewhere in the distance. Felt perfect. The deeper I went, the more the trail narrowed. The trees grew closer together, blocking out some of the sunlight. I checked my GPS. Everything was fine. I was on track. But the deeper I went, the less the trail felt like a trail. The ground was uneven, covered in thick roots and loose rocks. I had to be careful with every step. By midday, I reached a clearing and stopped for lunch. The place was beautiful. Rolling hills stretching for miles, the sun shining just right. I felt good. I felt safe. Then I noticed something. A few feet away from where I sat, there was a backpack. It was old and torn, covered in dirt and leaves like it had been there for a long time. I walked over, nudging it with my foot. Empty. Whoever left it behind must have been here months ago. I took a picture of it on my phone and moved on, trying not to think too much about it. As I kept hiking, the terrain got worse. The trees were so dense now that barely any light came through. I checked my GPS again. The signal was weak, but I was still on the right path. That's when I noticed it, the smell. It was faint at first, something sour and rotten. My stomach tightened. It wasn't animal decay. I had smelled that before. This was different, more like something had been sitting, rotting for weeks. I tried to ignore it and kept moving. After a few more hours, the sun was starting to set. I had planned to make camp soon, but I wanted to find a better spot. Then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A boot, just one, half buried in the dirt. It looked new, barely worn. And next to it, a piece of torn fabric stuck to a branch. A jacket. Someone had been here not long ago, and they left in a hurry. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. Something was wrong. I scanned the area, but it was too quiet now. No birds, no wind, just silence. I turned back. I wasn't going to camp here. I walked faster, checking my GPS every few minutes. But then my heart dropped. No signal. I swallowed hard and kept moving. The path should lead back to where I started, but everything looked different now. The trees seemed closer, the trail less visible. The smell was getting stronger, sticking to the back of my throat. My stomach turned. Then I heard it. Something moving. Not an animal. It was slow, deliberate, like someone stepping carefully through the woods. I turned fast, scanning the trees, but I saw nothing. My breathing was loud in my ears. I waited, listening. Nothing. I kept walking, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I just needed to keep going. I needed to get out of here. Then I saw something ahead, a structure. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I got closer, I realized it was real. A small wooden hut, old and broken. It was hidden between the trees, almost invisible from the trail. I hesitated. My gut screamed at me to turn back, but I had no idea where I was. Maybe there was a map inside or something useful. I stepped forward, reaching the door. It was slightly open. Inside, the air was thick, damp. My flashlight cut through the darkness. There was nothing but broken furniture, an old table, and a smell that made my stomach lurch. Something had been in here, recently. Then I saw the writing on the wall. It was carved deep into the wood. Leave now. I felt cold all over. My body moved before I could think. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. Branches scratched my face. My legs ached. But I didn't stop. I ran until I couldn't anymore, collapsing against a tree, gasping for air. My body was shaking. My mind raced. Then I saw it. Lights, far in the distance. I forced myself up and stumbled toward them. As I got closer, I realized what it was. A cabin. A real one with smoke coming from the chimney. Relief washed over me. I ran to the door, pounding on it. An old man answered, his face wrinkled with confusion. You all right, son? I tried to explain, but the words came out in gasps. He led me inside, giving me water, letting me sit. His cabin was warm, safe. When I finally calmed down, he asked where I had been. I told him about the trail, the smell, the boot, the writing on the wall. His face darkened. You shouldn't have gone that way, he said. That place, people go missing out there. I didn't sleep that night. The old man let me stay until morning, then pointed me in the right direction. I made it back to my car hours later, exhausted but alive. I never went back. I don't think I ever will. The road was barely a road anymore, just a narrow strip of dirt cutting through the trees, riddled with potholes and patches of mud from last night's rain. My headlights flickered over the uneven ground, the beams catching the eyes of something small and quick darting into the underbrush. A rabbit, maybe, or a fox. The engine groaned as I pressed the gas, the tires slipping for a second before gripping again. The GPS had stopped working half an hour ago, but the directions were simple enough. Follow this path until it ends at the cabin. I shouldn't have come here alone. The thought had been gnawing at me since I left the highway, but I pushed it down. It was just a weekend getaway, a chance to clear my head. No phone signal, no emails, no noise. Just me, the woods, and the old hunting cabin my uncle had left me in his will. I'd never even seen the place before, just a few faded photos of a wooden structure with a slanted roof, tucked between pines. The trees closed in tighter, branches scraping against the sides of the car like fingernails. I rolled down the window, letting in the damp, earthy smell of the forest. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of pine and something else. Something faintly sour, like wet leaves left to rot. Then the cabin appeared. It was smaller than I expected, hunched in a clearing like an animal waiting to pounce. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagging in the middle. The front porch had a single rocking chair, its paint peeling, the wood beneath cracked and splintered. A rusted metal bucket sat beside it, half full of rainwater. I turned off the engine. The silence rushed in, pressing against my ears. No birds, no wind, just the slow drip of water from the trees. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and stepped out. The ground was soft underfoot, the mud sucking at my boots. The key was where my uncle said it would be, under a loose floorboard near the steps. I crouched, fingers digging into the damp wood until I felt the cold metal. The lock was stiff, but after a few tries, the door creaked open. The inside smelled like mildew and old smoke. A single room with a wood stove in the corner, a narrow bed against the wall, and a table with a kerosene lamp. Dust floated in the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. I dropped my bag on the bed, the springs groaning under the weight. I should have checked the place first, but I was tired, and the drive had been longer than I thought. So I lit the lamp, ate a cold sandwich from my bag, and lay down. The mattress was thin, the blanket scratchy. Outside, the trees rustled, branches tapping against the roof. I closed my eyes. Something woke me. A sound, not the wind, not the trees. Something else. A scrape like wood dragging over wood. I sat up, heart hammering. The lamp had burned out, leaving the room in near total darkness. The only light came from the moon, casting long, jagged shadows through the window. I held my breath, listened. There it was again. Not from outside, from inside, under the floor. I swung my legs off the bed, my bare feet hitting the cold wood. The sound stopped. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just the house settling. Then it came again. A slow, deliberate scrape, like something moving. I grabbed the lamp, fumbling with the matches until the flame flickered to life. The light wavered, throwing shaky shadows across the walls. I knelt, pressing my ear to the floor. Silence. Then, a thump. Directly beneath me, my breath caught. There wasn't supposed to be anything under the cabin. No basement, no crawl space, just dirt. I stood, backing toward the door. The scraping came again, louder now, faster, like something digging, clawing. I didn't wait. I ran. The door slammed behind me as I bolted into the night. The cold air burned my lungs, my feet slipping in the mud. I didn't look back. Didn't stop until I reached the car. The engine roared to life, tires spinning as I reversed, the headlights sweeping over the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. The front porch. The rocking chair was moving, not from the wind. There was no wind. It was rocking, slowly, deliberately, like someone had just stood up from it. I slammed the car into gear and didn't stop driving until the trees were far behind me. I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear it again, the scrape of wood against wood, and I wonder what's under my floor. The sun had already started to dip below the horizon when I decided to head out. It wasn't the best time, but I wasn't looking for a leisurely hike. I needed to clear my head. I hadn't been to the trail in over a year, and I figured it was time to revisit it. Even if the shadows of my past experiences lingered on the edges of my memory, the trail was familiar, but not in the comforting way it used to be. When I first hiked it, the path seemed welcoming, with the scent of pine trees and the soft rustle of leaves beneath my feet. That was before everything changed. Now, even the most innocent sounds seemed eerie, like a warning I wasn't meant to ignore. I parked my car at the trailhead and stared at the path ahead. It was just a short, 3-mile loop, not too difficult but enough to give me some time away from everything. The air was still warm from the day's heat, but the evenings in the woods could get chilly, so I threw on a light jacket and checked my pack. I had everything I needed: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a flashlight in case I got caught in the dark. I wasn't expecting to be out that long, but it was always better to be prepared. As I started down the path, the sounds of the forest surrounded me. Birds were singing in the trees, and the wind whispered through the branches. The forest smelled earthy, damp from recent rain. For a moment, I could almost convince myself that I wasn't carrying the weight of my anxious thoughts along with me. The first mile was easy, and I was moving at a steady pace. The trail was well worn, a mix of dirt and rocks that shifted beneath my boots. I passed the familiar clearing where the sun used to hit just right, casting long shadows and making everything glow like a scene from a dream. But today, it felt off, like something was missing. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but the air had a heaviness to it, like the forest was holding its breath. I pushed on, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks. The deeper I went into the woods, the less the world around me seemed familiar. It was like I had entered a different place entirely. The trees grew thicker, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the fading light. The shadows deepened, stretching out long and unnaturally. I wasn't scared, at least not yet, but there was a sense of unease creeping in. The trail seemed more like a maze now, twisting in strange ways I didn't remember. I stopped to check my map, but the markers were unfamiliar, and I couldn't figure out where I was exactly. That was strange. The trail was supposed to be simple, but I kept going. The deeper into the woods I went, the more it felt like I was being watched. I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination, but every now and then, I would catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I'd turn quickly, only to see nothing but the rustling of leaves or a branch swaying in the breeze. Still, the sense of being observed was undeniable. I tried to shake it off. It was probably just animals. Deer, squirrels, maybe even a coyote or two. They were out there, I was sure of it. But something about the way the woods felt today made me second-guess everything. I kept walking, my heart starting to beat a little faster, my steps becoming less sure. It wasn't until I reached the second mile that I noticed the strange marks on the trees. At first, I thought it was just the usual scarring from weather or animals, but as I got closer, I realized these weren't normal scratches. They were deliberate, long and deep, as if something or someone had clawed at the bark. Some of the trees had multiple marks, like something had come through and left its mark as a warning. I should have turned back then. I should have listened to the warning signs. But I didn't. I pressed on. By now, the sun was completely gone, and the woods were cast in a twilight gloom. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam slicing through the dark. The trail ahead looked like it twisted into some sort of abyss, the path narrowing and winding around sharp turns. I could no longer see the sky through the trees, and the only light was from my flashlight and the faint, distant glow of the fading moon. The temperature had dropped. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, shivering slightly as the cold air wrapped around me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stopped and listened. There was no sound, no birds, no wind, nothing. Just an eerie silence that pressed down on me, making the air feel thick and heavy. The only sound I could hear was my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the gravel. I thought about turning back then, but something kept me going. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness, but I continued on, every step feeling heavier than the last. Then I heard it, a low growl, distant but unmistakable. It came from deeper in the woods, a guttural sound that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't an animal I recognized. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the bark of a coyote. It was something else, something primal. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to place the sound. But it wasn't something that could be placed. Not something I had ever heard before. The growl came again, this time louder, closer. It was like a warning, a threat in the darkness. My instincts screamed at me to run, to turn around and leave, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I found myself standing there, frozen, the flashlight shaking in my hand as I looked around, trying to see what was out there. Then, in the distance, I saw something. A figure. It was tall and dark, just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam. I couldn't make out details, but I knew it was there, watching, waiting, and then, before I could react, it disappeared into the trees. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Every part of me wanted to flee, but my body was locked in place, my mind swirling with fear and disbelief. Then a crack, the sound of a branch snapping. Something was moving toward me. I didn't think, I just ran. I didn't even know where I was going, just away. The beam of my flashlight bounced erratically as I ran, the shadows of the trees looming on all sides. The growling sound echoed behind me, getting closer, the sound of something following. I pushed harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Couldn't look back, couldn't stop. I just had to keep going. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I broke through the trees and stumbled onto a wider path. The familiar sight of the trailhead sign came into view, and I almost collapsed with relief. I could hear the sound of cars in the distance, the hum of life beyond the woods. I kept running, faster now, until I reached my car. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I jumped in, slammed the door, and locked it, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys to start the engine. As the car roared to life, I slammed my foot on the gas and sped off down the road, my heart still racing, the sound of the growling still echoing in my mind. I didn't stop driving until I was safely back home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was still out there, waiting. But I made it out. I survived, and I'll never go back to that trail. The hike had started like any other. Early morning, the air crisp, the trail empty. I liked it that way. No people, no noise, just the crunch of my boots on gravel and the steady rhythm of my breath. The map said this loop was 8 miles, easy enough for a half-day trek. I packed light, water, a protein bar, a pocket knife. No need for anything else. The first few miles were uneventful. The trees stood tall, their leaves rustling in the wind. Birds called out, sharp and sudden, then fell silent. The sun filtered through the branches in thin golden streaks, painting the ground in shifting patterns. I walked without hurry, taking my time, letting my thoughts drift. Then the clouds rolled in. They came fast, dark and heavy, blotting out the sun. The air grew thick, damp. A storm was coming. I hesitated, glancing back the way I'd come. The trail behind me looked the same as the trail ahead, narrow, winding, disappearing into the trees. I could turn around, hike back to the car, call it a day. But I was already halfway. Pushing forward seemed smarter. I kept walking. The first raindrops hit just as the trail began to climb. Cold, fat drops that splattered against my arms and face. The trees offered little shelter. Within minutes, the drizzle became a downpour. The dirt path turned slick, mud clinging to my boots, making each step heavier. My clothes soaked through, sticking to my skin. The wind picked up, howling through the branches, bending the smaller trees like they were nothing. I pulled my hood tighter and kept moving. The trail was harder to see now. The rain blurred everything, turning the world into a gray, shifting mess. My boots slipped in the mud. I caught myself on a tree trunk, bark rough under my fingers. My breath came faster. The temperature was dropping. I could see my breath in short, white puffs. Then I heard it, a sound sharp and out of place. Not the wind, not the rain, something else. I stopped, listened. Nothing, just the storm. I shook my head, kept walking. But then there it was again, a snap, like a branch breaking. I turned, scanning the trees. The rain made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The forest was a wall of gray and green, shifting in the wind. Nothing moved. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. I kept going. The trail dipped, leading me into a narrow gully. The rain had turned the ground into a shallow stream, water rushing over my boots. I stepped carefully, testing each foothold. One wrong move, and I'd be on my back, soaked and bruised. Then I saw it. Footprint. Not mine. Fresh, pressed deep into the mud. Too big to be mine. I stared at it. My stomach tightened. Someone else was out here. I looked around, heart pounding. The trees stood silent. The rain fell harder. I told myself it was nothing. Another hiker, maybe. Someone who'd passed through earlier. But the print looked fresh. The edges hadn't been washed away yet. I swallowed, kept moving. Faster now. The trail climbed again, steep and slippery. My legs burned. My breath came in short gasps. The wind howled, drowning out everything else. Then another sound. Not a branch this time. A voice. Muffled, distant, but definitely a voice. I froze. No one should be out here. Not in this storm. Not on this trail. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. The voice came again. Closer this time. A man's voice. Low, rough. I couldn't make out the words. My pulse roared in my ears. I ran, not thinking, just moving. My boots slid in the mud. I stumbled, caught myself, kept going. Branches whipped at my arms, my face. The rain stung my eyes. Behind me, footsteps. Heavy, fast. Someone was chasing me. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The trail twisted, turned. I didn't know where I was anymore. The trees blurred together. The rain was a wall, a curtain, hiding everything. My foot caught on a root. I fell. Hard. The impact knocked the air from my lungs. Mud filled my mouth, bitter and cold. I rolled onto my back, gasping, and then I saw him. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket soaked through. His face was shadowed, hidden under a hood. He stood over me. I scrambled back, hands slipping in the mud. He didn't move, just watched. Then he reached into his jacket. I braced myself, but he pulled out a map. A goddamn map. He held it out, shaking his head. "You're going the wrong way," he said. I stared at him. My heart still pounded. My breath still came too fast. He pointed behind me. Storms flooding the creek up ahead. Trails washed out. "You keep going that way, you'll hit a dead end." I didn't move, didn't speak. He sighed, folded the map, tucked it back into his jacket. "Follow me if you want. I know a way around." Then he turned, started walking. I stayed where I was, watching him go. The rain fell, the wind howled, and then slowly I got up and followed. I had been hiking for a few hours when I felt the first sign that something wasn't quite right. The morning had started off clear and bright, with the sun rising over the distant peaks. The air crisp and cool, perfect for a long walk. I'd chosen this trail on a whim, a less traveled path according to the map. I thought it would be a peaceful way to enjoy the outdoors, away from the usual crowds that filled the popular trails. I was alone, just the way I liked it. The crunch of my boots on the gravel path and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze were my only company. The forest around me was dense, with tall trees that stretched up into the sky, their branches twisting together above to form a canopy. Light filtered through the gaps, creating patterns on the forest floor. It was beautiful, calm, serene. But then, as I rounded a bend in the path, I felt it. A chill in the air, sudden and sharp. I paused, looking around, but everything seemed normal. Nothing out of the ordinary. I shrugged it off and kept walking, but the feeling lingered. An uncomfortable twinge at the back of my mind. It wasn't fear exactly, but something close to it. Like the forest itself was watching me, waiting for something. I picked up my pace, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I hadn't seen a soul since I'd started, and I hadn't expected to. I was deep in the woods now, far from the town or any main roads. It was exactly what I wanted. A chance to be alone, to clear my head. The path narrowed as I climbed higher, and the trees grew even thicker. The air felt heavier now, and the sun seemed to fade a little, as though the branches above were absorbing every ray. I hadn't brought much with me, just a light backpack with water, snacks, and my phone, though I knew there wouldn't be any signal out here. No one would be able to reach me, and honestly, I didn't want to be reached. I needed time to think, to be still. I passed a small creek, its water rushing over smooth rocks. I knelt down to refill my water bottle, the coolness of the liquid a welcome relief. As I drank, I heard a noise in the distance, something sharp, like a twig snapping underfoot. I froze, listening carefully. There was no other sound, nothing to indicate who or what might be out there. Could have been an animal or another hiker, though the latter seemed unlikely. I stood up and glanced around, but I saw nothing. Still, the sensation of being watched returned. It was subtle, but it was there. I quickened my pace once more, eager to put the feeling behind me. The forest seemed to grow darker the farther I went. The trees were closing in now, blocking out most of the light. The air was thick, damp with the scent of earth and moss. I checked my watch, nearly noon, though it felt later. The way the light shifted made it seem like the day was slipping away faster than it should have. As I walked, my thoughts started to drift. I thought about the world back home, about the things I left behind. But that's when I heard it again, the sound of something snapping. Only this time it was closer, much closer. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart was beating faster now. I turned around, scanning the trees behind me, but I saw nothing. The forest was still, too still. The birds had stopped singing. The wind had died down. It was like the whole place had gone quiet. I took a deep breath and started walking again, trying to shake off the unease that had settled into my bones. It was probably nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I continued up the path, the feeling only grew stronger. The forest felt oppressive now, as though the trees themselves were closing in on me. I looked around, hoping to catch sight of a landmark or something familiar, but the path ahead was indistinct, just more of the same trees, rocks, and underbrush. The trail had begun to disappear beneath the growing foliage. I was getting deeper into the woods now, and I realized I hadn't thought to bring a map with me. What had I been thinking? I was getting frustrated, a little anxious, too. I checked my phone again. No signal. Not that it mattered much. There was no way out except to keep going forward. Then I heard it again, the snapping. This time it was unmistakable. Something was moving behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but all I saw were the trees, their trunks twisted and dark. No movement, no sign of anything. I stood still for a moment, trying to calm myself, but my mind was racing. Could it be a person? But why hadn't I seen anyone on the trail? Why hadn't I heard anything else? My gut told me it wasn't another hiker. It wasn't anything human. I started walking faster, the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel now unnervingly loud in the silence. The air seemed to thicken with each step, as though the forest was holding its breath. Suddenly, the path narrowed sharply, and I had to step off onto a rocky ledge to avoid slipping. It was steeper here, the ground uneven. The trees were denser, blocking out even more light. I stumbled a little but caught myself before I fell. That's when I saw it. A shape. It was just a shadow at first, a dark outline against the trees, but as I focused, I saw it more clearly. A figure standing at the edge of the trail. Tall, too tall for a person, and completely still. It didn't move as I approached. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was something wrong about it. It didn't belong there. The figure was like a silhouette, too dark to make out any features. It was as if it absorbed all the light around it, like a hole in the forest itself. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at it, but eventually, I took a step back, and then another, and then I turned and ran. I ran through the trees, stumbling over rocks and branches, not daring to look back. The only sound in my ears was the pounding of my own heart and the rush of my breath. My mind was screaming at me to stop, to calm down, to think, but I couldn't. I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing in the shadows, waiting. I kept running, pushing myself harder, faster, my legs burning from the exertion. It felt like hours, though I knew it couldn't have been. The trail was getting harder to follow, and I wasn't sure where I was anymore. I was lost, completely turned around. The trees seemed to press in on me from every side, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled hands. But then, just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw something, a flicker of light through the trees. Hope surged in my chest. I wasn't sure what it was, but it was something different, something real. I made my way toward it, every step filled with anticipation. As I broke through the trees, I saw it. An old cabin, weathered and forgotten, nestled between the trunks. It was small, barely visible from the path. The door was slightly ajar, and a small wisp of smoke curled up from the chimney. I could hardly believe it. I'd found something familiar, something human. I didn't hesitate. I approached the cabin, my steps cautious but determined. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The interior was empty, except for dust and cobwebs. It looked abandoned, just a small room with a fireplace, a few old pieces of furniture, and the faint smell of wood and decay. But it was shelter. It was safety. I sat down on a chair by the fireplace, my heart still racing, trying to process what had just happened. I wasn't sure what I'd seen or what had been following me. I didn't want to think about it, didn't want to try to explain it. But I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer alone in that forest, and that was enough. As I sat there, catching my breath and listening to the wind outside, I realized that I had made it. I had survived whatever had been lurking in those woods. And tomorrow, when I left the cabin and made my way back to civilization, I would carry with me a story no one would believe. But that was okay, because I knew the truth. I had found safety in the strangest place, and I wasn't going back out there until I was ready. I had been looking forward to the hike for weeks. The weather was perfect, clear skies, crisp air, the kind of day that made you feel alive. I wasn't an expert hiker, but I'd done enough to know what I was doing. I picked a trail that seemed challenging but doable, a 6-hour loop through the mountains, a few miles from the nearest town. The kind of trail that promised solitude but wasn't so remote you'd get lost or hurt easily. I started early, well before sunrise, knowing the hike would take longer than I anticipated. The air was cool as I set out, the ground covered in morning dew, my breath visible in the stillness. The path was well marked at first, winding through tall pine trees. Birds chirped overhead, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. The sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink as I moved along the trail. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The occasional sound of my footsteps and the birds overhead were the only things that filled the silence. After a while, the path narrowed, the trees grew thicker, and the landscape became more rugged. I had to pay closer attention to my footing, the ground uneven and covered in roots, rocks, and the occasional patch of mud. But I wasn't concerned. I had maps, I knew where I was going, and it was peaceful, almost too peaceful. About 2 hours into the hike, I reached a fork in the trail. According to my map, both paths would eventually lead to the same place, but one looked a little steeper than the other. I wasn't in any rush, so I decided to take the harder path. There was something about the idea of pushing myself a bit more, the sense of adventure. The trail became steeper, winding upward through thick underbrush, the trees growing closer together. The air was getting thinner, and my breathing became heavier as I climbed. As I reached a higher elevation, the trail split again. This time, the sign wasn't as clear. One path veered sharply to the left, while the other seemed to fade away into the brush. I hesitated, unsure, but the path to the left looked more traveled, so I took it. I had a gut feeling it was the right way. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The trees grew denser, blocking out the sun. The temperature dropped, and the light dimmed as the trail twisted through a thick grove of evergreens. I noticed how quiet it had become. The wind had died down, the birds had stopped chirping, and there were no animals rustling in the underbrush. It felt unnatural. I felt uneasy, like something was off, but I brushed it off. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe the isolation was getting to me. The trail seemed to go on forever. At times, it became so overgrown I had to duck under branches or push through dense thickets of thorny bushes. My hands were scraped and my legs were getting sore. But still, I pressed on, driven by some mixture of determination and the hope that I would find an incredible view or a peaceful spot to rest. At some point, I stopped. I checked my phone to see how much longer I had before I would hit the summit. The map was showing me near the top, but when I checked the time, I realized it had taken far longer than expected. The phone had no signal, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had lost track of time. That's when I heard it, a faint sound like a cracking twig. I froze, listening. Nothing. I moved on, telling myself it was just an animal. But as I walked, the sounds started coming more frequently. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. It was as if something or someone was following me. I tried to stay calm, but my pulse quickened. There were no other hikers in sight, no other sounds besides the occasional creak of the trees and my own breathing. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. I picked up my pace, but the more I hurried, the more the sounds seemed to increase, as if something was mirroring my every move. I broke into a jog, then a full sprint, but the sounds only grew louder, closer. I didn't stop, not until I finally reached a clearing. My heart was pounding in my chest as I scanned the area. There was no sign of anyone, no sign of anything. Just the open space, surrounded by thick trees on every side. But something was wrong. I felt it, like the air itself was thickening, as if the forest was closing in on me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Maybe it was just nerves. I needed to stop freaking out and get my bearings. I pulled out my map and looked for a way to calm down. The summit was close. I was almost there. But when I looked back up, I froze. Something moved in the trees. I could see it clearly now. Someone was standing there, just inside the edge of the forest. I couldn't make out details, but the figure was tall, dark, and seemed to blend into the trees. I stood still, my heart hammering in my chest. I had no idea who they were, but I didn't feel safe. I took a deep breath and turned around, walking quickly at first, then breaking into a run. My mind raced with thoughts. Who was that? What did they want? The sound of my footsteps grew louder as I moved faster, my breath sharp and ragged in my chest. The trees around me blurred as I pushed myself harder, but the sounds of movement from the forest didn't stop. It was as if the figure was following me. I kept running, weaving through the trees, hoping to reach a trail I recognized. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I didn't stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a familiar marker, a trail sign with a yellow arrow. I was back on the main path. My pulse slowly started to calm down, but I didn't dare slow my pace. I kept running, not stopping until I reached the edge of the forest, where the path widened and the trees began to thin. It wasn't until I was back at the parking lot, breathless and exhausted, that I allowed myself to stop. I looked around, expecting to see someone or something, but there was nothing, just the empty lot and the quiet hum of nature. I was alone. No one had followed me, and I hadn't seen anything strange after I left the woods. I stood there for a while, catching my breath, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined it? The figure in the woods? The feeling of being followed? It didn't make sense. There had to be a logical explanation. I had just gotten spooked by the isolation, by the quiet, by the way the woods closed in around me. It had been nothing more than my own fear, amplified by the silence. I left the trailhead behind, heading back to my car, but I couldn't shake the feeling, the unsettling sensation that someone or something had been watching me, waiting. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, that I had overreacted, but a part of me knew the truth. The forest wasn't as empty as it seemed, and sometimes, when you're out there alone, the woods aren't as silent as you think. And that thought stayed with me long after I got in my car, started the engine, and drove away. I parked my truck at the edge of the trailhead, gravel crunching under my tires as I rolled to a stop. The air was crisp, clean in the way only mountain air can be. It smelled of damp earth and pine, the kind of scent that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. I stepped out, adjusting my pack and double-checking my supplies. Water, knife, first aid kit, protein bars, extra socks, everything was accounted for. This was a solo hike, a challenge I had been meaning to take on for months. The trail was remote, winding up into the mountains, promising a view worth every bit of the struggle. The sun was just beginning to lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I wanted to get at least a couple of miles in before setting up camp for the night. The first stretch of the trail was easy, a gentle incline with well-trodden dirt, but as I pressed deeper, the terrain became more rugged. Rocks jutted from the ground at odd angles, the path narrowing as it twisted through dense woods. It was the kind of isolation I craved, a break from the noise of life, a chance to clear my head. After about an hour, I reached a clearing. The trees opened up to reveal a ridge, and beyond it, the valley stretched out like a painting. Mountains in the distance, the sky deepening into that golden hour glow. I took a moment to breathe it in, sip some water, adjust my pack. Then I kept moving. I wasn't worried. I had done enough hikes to know my limits. But as I walked, an unease settled in. It was small at first, just a nagging sensation at the back of my mind. The kind of feeling you get when something is slightly off, but you can't put your finger on it. The forest had gone quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just my own footsteps crunching over dirt and fallen leaves. I pushed forward. The trail took me deeper into the trees, and the shadows grew longer. I checked my watch, still plenty of time before dark. But the uneasy feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I stopped to take another drink of water, scanning the area around me. Nothing. Just trees, endless trees, standing still as statues. I shrugged it off and kept going. Then I saw it, barely visible off the side of the trail, half hidden by overgrown ferns and brambles, was something that didn't belong. A torn piece of fabric, faded red, tangled in a low-hanging branch. I frowned, stepping closer. It looked like part of a jacket or a backpack, frayed at the edges as if it had been there for a long time. My stomach twisted. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone had just lost part of their gear. But the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I glanced around, scanning the trees. The sun was slipping lower, casting deep shadows that made everything look unfamiliar. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, but I picked up my pace anyway. Another mile passed, and the unease didn't fade. The trail was steeper now, my legs burning with each step. I welcomed the physical strain, anything to take my mind off the growing sense that something was wrong. Then I found the footprints. They were faint, barely noticeable in the dirt, but they were there. Fresh, too fresh. They weren't mine, and they weren't heading in the same direction I was going. They were coming toward me. I stopped cold. My heart pounded against my ribs. I listened. Nothing, just silence. I swallowed hard, glancing back the way I had come. No one, but someone had been here. Recently, I forced myself to keep walking. The sooner I reached my planned campsite, the better. My body was tense, every muscle on edge. I kept my knife within easy reach, scanning the trees as I moved. The sun dipped lower. The air cooled. The shadows stretched longer. I found a decent spot to set up camp. A small clearing with enough space to see my surroundings. I worked quickly, setting up my tent, starting a fire. The flames crackled to life, casting flickering light across the trees. I ate in silence, my ears tuned to every small sound. A branch snapping, a rustle in the undergrowth. Normal forest noises, but they didn't feel normal. As darkness settled in, my anxiety didn't ease. I felt exposed, like I was being watched. I told myself I was just on edge from finding those footprints. That's all it was. Nothing more. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something had pulled me from sleep. A sound. A movement. I lay still, barely breathing, listening. The fire had burned low, casting weak, flickering light. My tent walls felt paper-thin, useless. Then I heard it. A footstep. Close. Too close. I stayed frozen, heart hammering. Another step. Slow, deliberate. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. The fire crackled, casting a shifting glow beyond the tent walls. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything beyond those quiet, careful steps. Then they stopped, right outside my tent. My breath came shallow, quiet. My mind raced. Was it an animal? Person? I didn't move. The seconds dragged, stretching into eternity. Then, a long, slow exhale. Not mine. Panic surged through me. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to fight, to do something. But then, silence. The presence outside my tent didn't leave. It was still there. I knew it. I could feel it. But it wasn't moving. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. I didn't know. My muscles ached from staying so still. My knife felt slippery in my grip. Then, finally, the first hints of dawn broke through the trees, casting pale light over the campsite. I waited, listened. Nothing. I forced myself to move, slow, careful. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The forest was empty, still, but the footprints were there, right outside my tent, leading away into the trees. I packed up as fast as I could, heart pounding the entire time. I didn't eat, didn't drink, just moved. I didn't stop until I was back at my truck, my body aching, my mind racing. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I know this. I was not alone, and I don't think they ever left. I've been on a lot of hikes since then, but I never went back to that trail, and I never will. It was supposed to be a simple, peaceful hike, the kind where you leave your phone behind, breathe in the fresh air, and let the sounds of nature fill your head. A chance to disconnect, clear your mind, and just be with yourself. I had planned the hike for weeks, picked the route, mapped out the times, and packed the essentials. Summit Lake State Park had been on my radar for a while, though honestly, I had my reservations. I'd been there before, years ago, with my parents. It had been a place they loved, but there was something about the road leading there that always left me feeling uneasy. It wasn't much, just a strange heaviness in the air, a weird feeling that would creep over me. My mom had noticed it too. She'd said it was just the old trees or maybe the water, but the unease lingered, and no matter how many times we returned, I couldn't shake it. But today, that would change. I was going alone this time. No kids, no husband, just me, the trees, and the trail. I knew it would help me forget the rush of life and the chaos I'd been managing for so long. The weight of everything, from work to family life, had been building up, and I was in desperate need of some solitude. The morning was crisp, a slight chill in the air that would soon warm up under the sun. The trailhead was quiet, almost eerily so. Not a single other car in the parking lot. The kind of quiet that makes you question if you're really alone or if there's something just out of sight, waiting. I shrugged it off. No need to overthink things. I stepped onto the trail, boots crunching against the dirt, the faint rustle of leaves above me, the scent of pine in the air. The trail was fairly easy at first, narrow but well-trodden, leading me through tall trees with their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The path wound uphill, and the further I went, the less I could hear the noise of the outside world. It was just me and the forest. But then, something changed. It wasn't anything I could point to exactly. Maybe it was the way the air felt colder, or how the shadows seemed to grow deeper as I moved further into the woods. There were no birds singing anymore, no squirrels darting through the underbrush. The forest felt off, almost as if it were holding its breath. I tried to ignore it, kept walking. The sound of my boots against the trail was the only noise I could hear, and the rhythmic crunch, crunch, crunch did little to calm the growing sense of discomfort. I tried to focus on the scenery, the sun filtering through the leaves, the occasional chipmunk that would peek out from a log, the distant rustling of something moving through the woods. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I turned a corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. The trail ahead had split into two paths, one leading deeper into the forest, the other towards a ridge that overlooked the lake below. I hesitated, The path to the left, the one heading into the woods, looked darker, more overgrown. The other one, toward the ridge, was easier to follow, but I could already tell that the lake down below would be too far to reach by the time I reached the summit. I chose the path to the left, reasoning that the closer I got to the heart of the woods, the more I'd find peace. I'd be able to leave behind the noise and distractions of everyday life. The forest grew denser. The trail became steeper, and the shadows stretched longer, as though the sun was being blocked out by the trees themselves. The air grew colder still, and I could see my breath now, faint plumes that disappeared into the stillness around me. My pace slowed. Something about the forest was unsettling. The further I went, the more it felt like I was walking into a memory I couldn't quite place. That's when I heard it. A snap, a twig breaking, far off in the distance. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately stopped, holding my breath. I turned around, half expecting to see someone behind me, but no one was there. The silence returned, but it felt different now. It felt heavier. I checked my watch. I'd been hiking for nearly 2 hours, but it felt like time had somehow stretched, bending in a way that didn't make sense. I kept moving, though, because what else could I do? This was supposed to be my moment, my escape. If I let fear win, then it would take everything I'd worked for. I rounded another bend in the trail, and that's when I saw it. A rusted metal sign, half buried in the underbrush. It was a trail marker, but it wasn't anything official. It had been there for years, maybe decades, and it looked as though it had been placed without much thought. I could barely make out the faded letters on it, but what caught my attention wasn't the sign itself. It was the strange feeling that came over me when I looked at it. My stomach twisted, like I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to see. Still, I pushed on, ignoring the sensation crawling up my spine. But as I continued, I felt my steps slowing again, not because of the trail, but because of something else. It was as if the forest had become too still. The air had thickened, and the sound of my own footsteps began to echo louder and louder until it felt like the forest itself was mocking me. I wasn't alone. I wasn't sure how I knew, but the feeling settled into my chest like a weight. I kept walking, but my senses were heightened, alert to every movement in the trees, every rustle of leaves. That's when I heard the second snap, much closer this time. It wasn't the wind, I knew that. It wasn't an animal either. It was deliberate. Something was moving through the woods. I didn't turn around, but I could feel the eyes on me, the weight of a presence just out of sight, watching my every step. I quickened my pace, pushing through the undergrowth, my breath coming quicker now, my heart hammering in my chest. The trail seemed to narrow, the trees closing in on me, their branches stretching out like arms, reaching for me. Then, as I rounded another bend, I froze. There, in the clearing ahead, was a figure. Not a person, but something, an outline standing perfectly still. It was just tall enough to be human, but there was something wrong about it. The way it stood, motionless, staring ahead. It didn't seem to be aware of me. It was just there. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes, the weight of them bearing down on me. Without thinking, I bolted, running faster than I ever thought I could. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't care. I had to get away. The trail blurred around me as I ran, but no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling of that presence, right behind me. Then, I broke through the trees and found myself back at the split in the trail. I turned, gasping for air, but when I looked back, there was nothing there, just the quiet forest, peaceful and still. I wasn't sure what had happened, but the sensation of being watched lingered, the unease in my chest not fully gone. I stood there for a long moment, unsure if I should go back or keep going. But in the end, I chose the path to the ridge, the one with the view of the lake below. The climb was harder than I expected, but the exhaustion helped push away the fear. By the time I reached the top, the sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the lake below. The beauty of it was almost surreal. I stood there for a while, taking it all in, my heart slowly returning to a steady rhythm. The woods below me were silent now, and as I stood there, looking out over the water, I felt something finally shift. The weight that had been pressing on me for hours, maybe even days, lifted just a little. It wasn't gone entirely, but for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. I've always been the type to enjoy a quiet hike in the woods. Growing up in a small town surrounded by vast stretches of forest, it became my way to unwind. The forest felt like home to me. There's something comforting about the quiet rustle of leaves, the steady crunch of twigs underfoot, and the way the world seems to disappear as soon as you step off the beaten path. That morning, I packed light, a bottle of water, a snack, and my camera. I didn't expect much out of this hike. It was just another walk through a familiar trail near the mountains. The sun was high, the sky a soft blue, and there wasn't a cloud in sight. I set off, my boots sinking into the soft, damp earth as I moved deeper into the woods. The first few miles were uneventful, just the sound of birds chirping and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. The trees stretched up, tall and solid, like old guardians of the land. I felt at ease, like I always did in nature. I lost track of time, and it wasn't until the sun began to dip lower in the sky that I realized I had wandered farther than usual. That's when I started noticing things weren't quite the same. The air felt different, heavier. The trees grew denser, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie silence. I stopped for a moment, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. There were no birds now, no wind rustling through the leaves. It was as though the entire forest had gone still. I shrugged it off. Sometimes that's just the way things go in the woods, quiet spells that come and go. Still, I couldn't shake the strange sensation that I wasn't alone. I checked my watch. It was nearly 5:30 p.m. I knew I should head back soon, but the trail I was on didn't look familiar. I had taken a different path than usual, one that wasn't marked on my map. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, but there was no signal. Of course, that happens sometimes too. I thought back to the sign at the trailhead. It had warned about poor cell reception in the area, but I'd figured I'd be fine. I wasn't too far from town after all. But as I kept walking, a creeping unease started to settle in. I thought I heard something. At first, it was just a faint crack of a branch snapping. I stopped and listened carefully, but there was nothing. No wind, no animals, nothing. A few moments passed, and I convinced myself I was just imagining things. But then I heard it again, louder this time, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate steps, almost as though they were pacing me. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. Just trees and more trees stretching out in every direction. My pulse raced, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I called out, but my voice seemed to get swallowed by the dense forest. Maybe it was just another hiker, I thought. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I felt. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I quickened my pace, trying to push the growing anxiety from my mind. The path I was on seemed to wind deeper into the woods, the trees becoming thicker, their shadows growing longer. It was as though I was being led further into a part of the forest that I wasn't meant to be in. The sound of footsteps followed me, always just out of sight. Whenever I turned to look, nothing was there. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, and the quiet of the forest was now oppressive. I stopped again, hoping to gather myself, but the oppressive silence made my skin crawl. Then I heard it, closer this time. A voice, faint and distant, almost a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone made my blood run cold. The hairs on my arms stood up, and every instinct in my body screamed to turn back. I hesitated for a moment, but the voice came again, clearer this time. My stomach churned as the words began to make sense, though they weren't words at all. They were just sounds, sighs, breaths, like someone trying to speak but failing to form coherent words. The sound was coming from behind me. I turned again, but there was nothing there. The forest remained still and silent. I couldn't tell how long I stood there, staring into the woods, but the feeling of being watched never left. At this point, I knew I had to head back. I couldn't trust my sense of direction anymore. The path, which should have been clear, was now tangled and confusing, as though the trees themselves were shifting, rearranging to block my way. I turned back the way I thought I had come, hoping to retrace my steps, but everything looked different now. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper. I couldn't remember this section of the trail. The silence hung heavy, like the air before a storm. The footsteps started again, this time faster, more deliberate. They were right behind me now, and I could feel the breath of someone or something close against the back of my neck. I dared not look, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me, urging me to move faster. Panic set in. My feet began to stumble, and I rushed forward, no longer caring if I was on the right path. I just needed to get away from the feeling that something was chasing me. The sound of my heartbeat thundered in my ears, and I could feel the heat rising in my face. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way, and I found myself falling into a small ravine. My ankle twisted as I hit the ground hard, and a jolt of pain shot through my leg. I bit my lip to keep from screaming, clutching my ankle as I lay there, trying to catch my breath. I glanced up, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. A figure, not far away, standing at the edge of the ravine, was a silhouette. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was watching me. The same eerie sensation from before gripped me. This wasn't just someone lost like me. There was something wrong about it. It was standing unnaturally still, like it was waiting for something. I tried to scramble to my feet, but my leg wouldn't cooperate. The figure took a step forward, and that's when I realized the truth. It wasn't human. His body was too still, too rigid. His posture was wrong. The way it moved was unnatural, as though it was not quite in sync with the world around it. A sharp pain in my leg reminded me that I needed to move, to get away, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It didn't make a sound, but the air around it felt charged, as if the space itself was disturbed by its presence. With every ounce of strength I had, I managed to push myself up on one leg, using a nearby tree for support. My breath came out in sharp gasps, and I limped away, trying not to look back, afraid that if I did, it would be right behind me. The figure didn't follow. Instead, it stood there, still as a statue, watching me. And with each step I took, I felt a little safer, but the fear didn't entirely leave me until I made it back to the main trail. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the path. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. I didn't stop until I made it back to my car. I didn't look back at the forest, didn't dare to glance at the trees behind me. I just drove, my hands gripping the wheel, my mind reeling from what I just experienced. It's been days now, and every time I close my eyes, I can still see that figure standing in the woods. But I'm back home, and I'm safe. I don't know what I encountered that day, but I know this much: it wasn't natural. I'm done hiking for a while, maybe even for good. I should have checked the map more carefully. That thought ran through my head over and over as I pushed forward, my boots sinking slightly into the damp ground with every step. I had planned the hike for weeks, picking a remote trail in the mountains where I wouldn't see another soul for miles. It was supposed to be a test of endurance, just me and the wilderness, a way to clear my head after the stress of life had been piling up. The first few miles had been fine, peaceful even. Birds chirped, a light breeze rustled the leaves, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in a way that made the world feel untouched. But then the trail started narrowing, the markers becoming less frequent. I must have missed a turn somewhere, because the next thing I knew, I was in an area that didn't match anything on my map. I wasn't worried yet, just a little annoyed with myself. I figured if I kept moving in one direction, I'd hit another marked path eventually. That was hours ago. Now the sun was lower, the air cooling rapidly. My pack felt heavier on my shoulders, the straps digging into my collarbone. The forest around me was different from where I had started. Denser, the trees packed closer together, the undergrowth thicker. I had stopped seeing any signs of foot traffic a while back. The realization that I might be properly lost was settling in like a weight on my chest. I adjusted my pack and pressed on, trying to ignore the tight feeling in my gut. The ground was uneven here, roots snaking across the dirt like veins. Every step needed to be careful, deliberate. I didn't need an injury on top of everything else. Then I saw it. At first, it didn't register as anything unusual, just a large mound of earth covered in moss and leaves. But as I got closer, I noticed the way it rose unnaturally, how the ground around it was disturbed. It looked like something had been buried here, but the soil hadn't settled right. My stomach clenched. I don't know why I did it, but I nudged the edge of the mound with my boot. The earth crumbled, revealing something pale underneath. My heart lurched. I stepped back quickly, nearly tripping over a root. My breathing was loud in my ears. I didn't want to see what was under there. I knew I shouldn't, but my body moved before my mind could stop it. I crouched down and brushed away more of the dirt. The more I uncovered, the harder it became to breathe. It was a shoe, a hiking boot, just like mine, except old and partially decayed. And inside it, I stood up so fast I got lightheaded. My vision blurred for a second before snapping back into focus. I couldn't do this. I couldn't stay here. Someone had been buried out here. Not just someone who had hiked here, who had worn boots just like mine, who had probably thought they were just going for a simple trip into the wilderness. My whole body was screaming at me to move, so I did. I turned and started walking, then jogging, then running. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away from that place. My pulse hammered in my skull. My feet caught on roots. My arms slapped against tree branches. I needed to find a marked trail. I needed to get out. The forest felt different now, the trees pressing in on me, the air thick and unmoving. Every sound made me jump. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, my own breath ragged in my throat. I was losing daylight. If I didn't find my way back before nightfall, I was screwed. After what felt like forever, I stopped to catch my breath. My legs were burning, my lungs heaving. I listened, hoping to hear running water or any sign of civilization. Instead, there was only silence, the kind of silence that made my skin crawl. Then a sound, a low, distant hum. At first, I thought it was my ears ringing from all the exertion. But no, it was real, a mechanical sound, something unnatural in the middle of nowhere. I turned toward it, moving carefully now. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a generator, a low, steady rumbling. I picked up my pace, pushing through the brush, my heart hammering. Then I saw the cabin. It was old, the wood gray and weathered. The windows were boarded up, but the door was slightly ajar. The generator sat beside it, sputtering softly. My brain told me to leave it alone, to turn around and find another way. But I needed help. I needed to know if there was someone here who could point me back to the main trail. I stepped closer. The air smelled like damp wood and something else, something foul. My stomach churned, but I ignored it. I reached for the door and pushed it open slowly. Inside, it was dark. The only light came from the setting sun through the cracks in the boards. The smell was stronger here, heavy and rotting. My eyes adjusted, and I saw what was hanging from the rafters. Meat, strips of it drying on hooks, but they weren't from any animal I knew. My breath caught in my throat. My feet moved before my brain could process what I was seeing. I turned and ran, not caring about the noise, not caring about anything except getting as far away as possible. I didn't stop running until I burst through a tree line and stumbled onto a dirt road. My legs gave out and I hit the ground hard. Gravel bit into my palms. I looked up, and there it was, a ranger station, its lights glowing in the early evening. I don't know how long I sat there before someone found me. A ranger stepped outside, startled by my sudden appearance. He rushed toward me, asking questions, but I couldn't answer. My brain was still back in that cabin, staring at the hooks. Later, when I managed to speak, I told them everything. About the mound, about the cabin, about what I saw. A search team went out that night, but they found nothing. No mound, no cabin, just forest. I left the next morning. I haven't hiked alone since. I started my hike early in the morning, just after sunrise. The air was crisp, the kind that wakes you up better than coffee. The trail was empty, which I liked. It was just me, the sound of my boots crunching dirt, and the rustling of leaves. I had picked a remote trail in the mountains, about a 3-hour drive from home. The kind of place where you wouldn't run into anyone unless they had planned to be there. It wasn't a marked trail either, just something I had read about online, buried in a forum where people talked about backcountry hikes no one else knew about. I liked that. I liked the solitude. For the first couple of miles, the hike was easy. A slow incline, packed dirt beneath my feet, and a thin fog that clung to the trees, making everything feel still. The forest was dense, the trees tall and close together. The further I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no wind, just me. It was peaceful at first. Around mile 4, the terrain changed. The dirt turned to loose rock, and I had to focus more on my footing. I like challenges, but this was trickier than I expected. I slipped twice, catching myself before I went down. I told myself it was fine, just a part of hiking. By the time I hit mile 6, I hadn't seen a single sign of another person. That was normal, but something about it started to feel off. The forest felt too still. I kept going, brushing it off. Then I saw something weird. A shoe. It was old, torn up, sitting on the side of the trail. A hiking boot too big for a kid, but small enough that I figured it must have belonged to a woman. I stopped and stared at it for a while. It didn't make sense. You don't just lose a shoe while hiking. I looked around, but there was nothing else. No bag, no clothes, no other shoe. Just that one, sitting there like someone had placed it there on purpose. I kept moving. At mile 7, I found something else. A torn piece of fabric caught on a low branch. Dark green like a jacket. The edges were frayed. Something about it made my stomach feel heavy. I told myself it was nothing. People lost things all the time. A hiker could have passed through here years ago, left a shoe, ripped their jacket, and kept going. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't that simple. The further I went, the worse the trail got. The trees pressed in tighter, the ground turned uneven, and my stomach wouldn't settle. I wasn't afraid, but something in me was on high alert. I kept moving, slower now, watching my surroundings more carefully. Then I smelled it. Rot. Not the kind of rot from a dead animal. Worse, the kind that gets into your throat and stays there. I stopped, scanning the trees. The smell was coming from ahead. I didn't want to go forward, but I didn't want to turn back either. I told myself it could be anything. A deer, maybe, but the smell was strong. Too strong. I moved forward carefully, listening now, my boots making barely any sound on the soft ground. The trees opened up just a little, and I saw something ahead. First, I thought it was a pile of rocks, but as I got closer, my stomach turned. It wasn't rocks. It was a tent. Old, collapsed, covered in dirt. The fabric was ripped in places, the poles bent. Next to it, a backpack lay open, its contents scattered. Clothes, a flashlight, an old camping stove. Everything was covered in dirt and leaves, like it had been there for a long time. The smell was worse now. I took a step closer, my foot sinking into the soft earth. I felt sick. Then I saw the hand. It was barely visible, half buried in the dirt near the tent. Pale fingers curled slightly. I backed up fast, nearly slipping on the loose soil. My breathing was too loud now, too fast. I didn't want to be here anymore. I turned and started walking back the way I came, moving faster than I should have. Every part of me screamed to run, but I couldn't. Running would be stupid. Running meant making noise. I walked for a long time, glancing back every few minutes, feeling watched. The trees felt closer than before, like the forest itself wanted me gone. The smell faded, but the feeling didn't. By the time I reached my car, the sun was starting to set. I threw my gear into the back seat, got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a minute, breathing. I should have called the police. I know that, but I didn't. Instead, I drove home, fast, my hands tight on the wheel. I haven't gone hiking since. I had been planning this solo hiking trip for months. The idea was simple. 3 days in the mountains, off-trail as much as possible, carrying everything I needed on my back. I had my gear dialed in: lightweight tent, sleeping bag rated for below freezing temperatures, enough food to last me, and a GPS with spare batteries in case things went sideways. I wasn't worried. I'd done this before. The drive to the trailhead was long, and by the time I parked my truck at the edge of the forest, the sun was already dipping behind the peaks. I checked my pack one last time, locked the truck, and started walking. The plan was to hike about 5 miles in before setting up camp for the night, just far enough away from civilization to really feel alone. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well maintained, the air was crisp, and the occasional bird call was the only sound I heard. As I moved deeper into the woods, I started feeling that familiar mix of excitement and unease that always came with being alone in the wild. Something I'd learned to ignore. Fear was just a distraction out here. But after about 3 miles, I decided to cut off the trail and head into the thicker part of the forest. That's where I really wanted to be. Away from people, away from the well-worn paths. The forest swallowed me quickly. The trees were massive, old growth, their trunks thick and gnarled. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I had to navigate carefully, stepping over fallen branches, squeezing through dense undergrowth. After another hour, I found a good spot to camp. A small clearing surrounded by trees, with a natural windbreak on one side. I set up my tent, boiled some water for dinner, and sat down to eat as the last light faded from the sky. The night was cold, but I was used to it. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind in the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up to something moving outside my tent. It wasn't loud, just the soft crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. I stayed still, listening. Probably just a deer. I'd had animals walk through my campsites before, but then the steps stopped right outside my tent. I reached for my knife, heart hammering. The fabric of my tent was thin, and if something or someone was standing there, I wouldn't know until they moved. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the sound moved away, footsteps fading into the trees. I exhaled slowly, probably just an animal. The next morning, I found nothing. No tracks, no signs of anything passing through. I brushed it off and packed up camp. I had a full day of hiking ahead of me, and I wasn't about to let my imagination ruin the trip. I moved deeper into the mountains, climbing higher, pushing through dense brush. The terrain was rough, but I liked the challenge. I didn't see a single person all day. By mid-afternoon, I found another good spot to camp, a flat area near a small stream. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a small fire, and ate dinner as the sun set behind the mountains. That night, I woke up again. But this time, it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing, slow, deliberate, just outside the thin layer of nylon separating me from whatever was out there. I gripped my knife tight, barely breathing. The sound stayed for what felt like hours, just beyond the tent. Then it moved, circling. Not an animal, not a bear, something that knew I was in there. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in my sleeping bag, knife in hand, waiting for the first light of morning. When the sun finally rose, I threw open the tent and scanned the clearing. Nothing. No tracks, no broken branches. Nothing. But something had been there, and it had been watching me. I packed up fast. My original plan was to hike deeper into the mountains, but now I just wanted to get out. I started moving back the way I'd come, back toward the truck, pushing hard, not stopping to rest. I wasn't scared. Not exactly, but I didn't want to be out here any longer than I had to be. By late afternoon, I was maybe 5 miles from the truck when I spotted something through the trees. A structure, old wooden, barely standing. I hadn't seen it on my way in, but I had cut off trail early. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer. It was a cabin, or what was left of one. The roof had partially caved in, the walls were weathered and cracked. It looked abandoned, forgotten. But as I got closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, fresh ones, leading inside. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me to turn around and keep walking. But I stepped forward, peering through the doorway. The inside was dark, the air stale, broken furniture, a rusted stove. But what caught my attention was the sleeping bag in the corner. Not old, not rotted. New. Someone had been here, recently, and then I noticed something else. Scratched into the wood of the far wall, deep and jagged. Leave. I turned and walked away, fast. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, heart pounding, sweat soaking through my clothes despite the cold air. I threw my pack in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. Then I sat there, breathing hard, eyes scanning the tree line. I never saw anyone, never heard anything else. But I knew someone had been out there with me, watching, waiting, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out who or why. I set out early, before the sun had even started to lighten the horizon. The air was damp with the kind of cold that settled deep into your bones, but I liked it, kept me awake, focused. I had planned this solo hike for months, picking a trail that wasn't too remote but still isolated enough to avoid weekend crowds. The route was a loop, about 15 miles, winding through thick forests, over ridgelines, and past an old fire lookout before circling back to my car. It was supposed to take me most of the day. I carried plenty of water, some food, a map, a compass, and a backup battery for my phone. I wasn't reckless. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well maintained, the dirt packed firm beneath my boots, pine needles softening each step. Birds called out in the trees. The sun began to rise, and everything felt calm, peaceful. I made good time, stopping every so often to take a sip of water or adjust my pack. My breathing was steady, my legs strong. About 6 miles in, the path narrowed. The trees grew denser, their branches pressing in, and the sunlight barely made it through. The undergrowth was thick, the air heavier. The trail was still visible but less traveled, smaller, less defined. I noticed animal tracks in the dirt, some deep and fresh, but I couldn't tell what had made them. I kept moving. At around mile 8, I reached the old fire lookout. It was abandoned, weather-worn, and half-collapsed. The roof had caved in, and the wooden steps leading up to what was left of the structure were broken and rotting. I paused there to eat. The wind had picked up at this higher elevation, rushing through the trees like a distant roar. I checked my phone. No service. That was expected, but I still felt a slight unease knowing I was completely cut off. I didn't linger long. The trail continued past the lookout, dropping down into a steep valley before climbing again on the other side. The descent was tricky, the ground loose with dry leaves and hidden rocks. I moved carefully, planting my feet with each step, but about halfway down, the dirt gave way under me. I slid fast, grabbing at branches, but they snapped in my hands. My hips slammed into something hard, pain flaring sharp and hot, and then I was at the bottom. For a few moments, I just lay there, trying to catch my breath. My side ached. My palms were scraped raw, but nothing felt broken. I sat up slowly. My water bottle had come loose and rolled a few feet away. I reached for it, and that's when I saw it. Something was on the ground ahead of me, partially hidden by leaves. It was a backpack, faded, torn, with one strap missing, and it wasn't mine. I hesitated, listening. The forest was silent, too silent. Even the wind had died down. I stood up carefully, testing my leg. It hurt but held my weight. I limped closer to the backpack. Dirt and moisture had seeped into the fabric, and when I nudged it with my foot, the zipper looked rusted shut. It had been here a long time. I crouched, staring at it. My mind ran through possibilities. Someone had lost it, abandoned it. Maybe it had belonged to a hiker who'd gotten injured and been rescued, leaving their gear behind. But then I noticed something else. A few feet away, barely visible beneath the underbrush, was a shoe. And it wasn't empty. I took a step back, my stomach tightening. The shoe was old, the laces frayed, but there was still a foot inside. I turned, scanning the trees. My breathing was loud in the silence. My first instinct was to run, but I forced myself to think. If this was a body, it had been here a long time. There was no smell, no insects buzzing, just stillness. I needed to mark the location and get help. I reached for my phone, knowing there was no service but hoping I could at least get GPS coordinates. My fingers trembled as I snapped a picture. Then I took a deep breath and started moving. The climb out of the valley was slow and brutal. My hips screamed with each step, but I kept going. I was about a mile away from the fire lookout when I saw something that stopped me cold. There were footprints on the trail, fresh ones, leading in the same direction I was going. I stared at them. The prints were deep, made by heavy boots, and they hadn't been there earlier. Someone else was on this trail. My mind raced. The body in the valley had been there for years, but this was recent. I stepped carefully, heart hammering. The trees pressed in, shadows stretching long. Every sound made me flinch. A branch cracked somewhere off to my right, and I froze. Then silence. I forced myself to keep moving, but my pace was slower now, more cautious. The prints stayed ahead of me, always just far enough that I never saw who made them. My gut told me to leave the trail, cut through the trees, but my compass and map were in my pack, and I didn't trust my sense of direction enough to risk it. I had to stick to the path. Another half-mile, and the prints veered off. They disappeared into the undergrowth, heading toward the ridge. I didn't stop. I didn't look. I just kept moving. It felt like hours before I finally saw the trailhead. My car was the only one in the lot. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking as I unlocked the door and climbed in. I locked it immediately, my breath coming in short gasps. My hip throbbed. My palms stung. I sat there for a long time, gripping the wheel, trying to process everything. The body in the valley, the footprints, the silence in the trees. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station. They took me seriously when I showed them the picture. A search team was sent out that evening. I don't know what they found. I never went back. But sometimes, when I hike alone, I still get that feeling. That silence pressing in, the sense that someone somewhere is watching. I had been planning the solo hike for months. The plan was simple. 3 days through a remote section of the national forest, following an old, lesser-known trail that barely showed up on maps. It was supposed to be an adventure, a way to disconnect and clear my head. I packed everything I needed: tent, food, water filter, first aid kit, extra layers, even a small emergency beacon in case of a real emergency. Everything was in place. Day 1 was uneventful. I parked my truck at the trailhead, double-checked my gear, and set out. The first few miles were standard hiking fare. Pine trees, uneven dirt paths, the occasional bird or small animal darting away at my approach. The deeper I went, the less traveled the path became. By the time I set up camp for the first night, I hadn't seen another person since I left the parking area. I was completely alone, exactly as I had wanted. The second day was when things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small things that gnawed at the back of my mind. The trail was supposed to be old but still maintained, yet I started noticing signs that no one had used it in years. Fallen trees blocked the path in places where they should have been cleared. Thick undergrowth tangled around my legs, forcing me to slow down and pick my way carefully forward. I checked my map and GPS several times, but I was still on course. The path just seemed forgotten. Around midday, I came across something that made my stomach twist. A deer carcass lay half hidden in the brush just off the trail. That wasn't strange on its own. Predators existed out here, but the way it had been left was disturbing. Its body was mostly intact, no signs of being eaten, just a gaping wound along its belly. No scavengers had touched it. Flies buzzed around it, but that was all. Something had killed it, but nothing had fed on it. I forced myself to move on. I wasn't about to let some dead animal ruin my trip. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. I hiked another few hours before stopping to rest. The wind had picked up, making the trees sway and groan. The sky was overcast now, casting the forest in dull gray light. That was when I noticed it, the absolute silence. No birds, no insects, just the wind in the trees. I sat still, listening. The forest always had noise, even if it was just the distant rustling of an animal in the underbrush. But there was nothing. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind drowning everything out, but deep down, I knew that wasn't right. I should have turned back then, but I didn't. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. So I pressed on. By late afternoon, I found a decent spot to set up camp for the night. A small clearing, relatively flat ground, a few fallen logs to sit on. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. As I set up my tent and started preparing my small cook stove, that feeling of unease never left me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something standing at the tree line. There was never anything there. That night was when it got worse. I was lying in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind outside. The tent walls rustled lightly, and I could hear the distant creaking of trees swaying. Then I heard something else. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal. A deer, maybe. But these weren't aimless animal steps. They were slow, deliberate, crunching softly on the forest floor. My breath caught in my throat. I strained my ears, trying to figure out how close they were. They stopped, just outside my tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I waited, my heart hammering in my chest. The seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing. Then the footsteps started again, but this time, they were moving away. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, gripping the handle of my knife, listening to every sound. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light filtered through the trees, I crawled out of my tent and scanned the area. No tracks, no sign that anything had been there, but I knew what I heard. My rational mind tried to tell me it was an animal, but my gut told me otherwise. I had spent enough time in the woods to know the difference between a passing deer and something that was deliberately walking up to my tent. I packed up quickly. The plan had been to hike another full day before turning back, but I decided to cut my trip short. Something didn't feel right, and I wasn't about to ignore that feeling. The hike back was worse than the hike in. The forest seemed darker, the silence heavier. Every so often, I would hear something in the distance. A branch snapping, a rustling in the underbrush. But when I stopped to listen, there was nothing. It felt like I was being followed. I walked faster. I forced myself not to run. Running in the woods was dangerous. One wrong step, one twisted ankle, and I would be stranded. So I kept moving, pushing myself harder than I ever had on a hike. By the time I reached the truck, I was out of breath and drenched in sweat. I threw my pack into the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away. I still don't know what was out there. Maybe it was just paranoia. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But I've never gone back to that trail, and I don't think I ever will. I started my hike early, before the sun had fully risen. The air was cool, damp from the rain the night before, and the scent of wet earth filled my lungs. The trail was barely marked, just a faint path winding through thick trees, but I had planned this route for weeks. It was supposed to be a secluded, peaceful hike through untouched wilderness. I wanted a challenge, something away from crowded national parks or well-maintained trails. The first few miles were easy. My boots sunk into the soft, muddy ground, and the forest was alive with sounds. Birds chirping, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of some unseen animal. I felt good, strong. The weight of my pack sat comfortably on my shoulders, and my legs carried me forward with ease. I knew the trail would eventually become more difficult, but I wasn't worried. I had experience, and I had prepared for this. I had my GPS, my map, enough supplies to last me in case something went wrong. But everything felt right, peaceful. After about 2 hours, the path started to narrow. The trees grew thicker, branches clawing at my arms as I pushed through. The sunlight barely made it through the canopy, and the sounds of the forest began to change. The birds grew quieter, The rustling in the underbrush stopped. It was subtle at first, something I didn't really notice until it was too late. I kept walking, telling myself it was nothing. Animals move in and out of areas all the time. But the silence felt wrong. It wasn't just a quiet moment in the woods. It was absolute. No wind, no animals, just me, my breathing, and the sound of my boots squishing in the mud. I checked my GPS. The signal was weak, but I was still on the right path. My map confirmed it. I should have been about halfway to my planned campsite, a small clearing near a river where I could refill my water and rest before continuing in the morning. I walked another mile, maybe two, before I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. A set of footprints, not mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the mud, heading in the same direction I was going. I stopped, staring at them. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. This was an old trail barely known. I had found it in an old guidebook, buried between other, more popular routes. I had searched online, but no one had mentioned it. I crouched down, studying the footprints. They were big, maybe a size 12 or 13. A man's, definitely, but something about them made me uneasy. The stride was long, too long, almost unnatural, like whoever made them was moving fast, maybe even running. I looked ahead. The footprints continued, weaving slightly, as if the person was stumbling or in a hurry. I thought about turning back, but I had come too far. My campsite wasn't much farther, and maybe, just maybe, someone else had found the same guidebook I had. Maybe they had just gone ahead of me. I kept walking. The footprints stayed with me, always ahead, always leading deeper into the woods. I checked my GPS again. The signal was gone. My phone showed no bars. That wasn't unusual in deep forests, but it still made my stomach twist. I kept moving, focusing on my breathing, on the weight of my pack, on the sound of my boots. But my mind kept going back to those footprints. Then I saw something else. A torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. It was dark, maybe black or navy, and frayed at the edges, like it had been ripped. I reached for it, hesitated, then pulled it free. It was damp, heavy with moisture from the rain, but the tear looked fresh. I turned it over in my hands, then looked ahead. The footprints were still there, leading forward. And now I realized they were deeper, like whoever had made them had started carrying something. My mouth went dry. I thought about turning back again. I could make it to my car before dark if I hurried. But I had no signal. And if someone was out here, hurt, carrying something, or someone, I couldn't just leave. I pushed forward. The trees grew denser, the path almost non-existent now. I had to move slower, careful not to trip over roots or hidden holes in the ground. Then I smelled it. A metallic, sharp scent. Blood. I stopped, heart hammering. The footprints were just ahead, leading to a small clearing. The trees opened up, revealing a patch of ground littered with broken branches and disturbed earth. And in the center of it all, a backpack, torn open, its contents spilled out. Clothes, a sleeping bag, food wrappers. The fabric was shredded, like something had clawed through it. I looked around, scanning the trees. I saw no movement, heard nothing. The silence pressed against me, heavy, suffocating. I stepped closer. Blood, on the ground, smeared against the torn backpack. Not a lot, but enough. Enough to make my hands shake. I crouched, my fingers brushing over the fabric. It was damp, not from rain, but from something else. Something warm, recent. Then, in the distance, a sound. Not an animal, not the wind. Footsteps, heavy, fast, coming straight for me. I ran. I didn't think. I just ran. My pack slammed against my back, my boots slipping in the mud, branches whipping against my face. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was coming. I just ran. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes? Hours? My lungs burned. My legs screamed. But I didn't stop. Not until I saw something familiar. The trailhead. My car. I stumbled toward it, gasping, hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and sat there, trying to breathe, trying to process what had just happened. I never saw who or what was following me. But I know this. I wasn't alone out there, and I'm never going back. I started my hike early in the morning, just as the sun was coming up. The sky was a pale blue, the air crisp and cool. I had planned this trip for months, mapping out the trail and packing everything I thought I'd need. Food, water, a knife, a flashlight, extra batteries, a map, and a compass. I wasn't a beginner, but I wasn't an expert either. Just someone who liked the peace and quiet of the woods. The trail was supposed to be an easy one, about 10 miles round trip. I'd read that it was mostly flat, with only a few steep parts, nothing too bad. I figured I could do it in 5 or 6 hours if I kept a steady pace. The first few miles were perfect. Birds chirped in the trees, squirrels darted across the trail. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. It was the kind of morning that made me feel alive. The sun was filtering through the branches, casting dappled light across the dirt path. Everything was calm, peaceful. Then, about 3 miles in, I noticed something strange. The forest had gone quiet. No birds, no squirrels, no rustling leaves. Just silence. I stopped walking and listened. The only sound was my own breathing, the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt. I told myself it was nothing. Animals move on. Maybe a predator was nearby, and they'd all gone into hiding. I kept going, shaking off the unease that had started creeping in. The path narrowed as I moved deeper into the woods. The trees were thicker here, their trunks stretching high above me, their branches tangling together to block out most of the sunlight. The air felt colder. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself and kept walking. Then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, leading in the same direction I was heading. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail that morning. No cars at the trailhead, no signs of campers. But someone had been here recently. I stopped and crouched down, looking at the prints. They were deep, pressed hard into the damp soil, like whoever made them was carrying something heavy. I followed them, feeling my pulse pick up a little. I wasn't sure why I was so uneasy. People hike all the time. Maybe someone had started earlier than I did. Maybe they were off-trail, camping somewhere nearby. But something felt off. I kept walking, my eyes on the footprints. They stayed on the path for another mile, then veered off into the woods. That should have been the end of it. I should have kept going, ignored them, but I didn't. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe stupidity, but I turned and followed them. The underbrush was thick. Branches scraped at my arms. Leaves crunched under my boots. The deeper I went, the harder it was to see the prints, but I could still make them out. Then, after about 20 minutes, I saw something ahead of me. A backpack. It was lying against a tree, half-zipped, with clothes spilling out of it. A jacket, a pair of socks, a water bottle lying on its side. Everything was damp, like it had been sitting there overnight. I stopped and looked around. The forest was still quiet, too quiet. I took a step closer, then another. The air smelled different here, not just like damp earth and pine, but something else, something sour. I bent down and picked up the water bottle. The plastic was cracked, empty. The clothes were wrinkled and dirty. And then I saw the blood. Not a lot, just a few drops dried into the fabric of the jacket. But it was enough. My stomach clenched. I should have turned back right then. I should have left, gone straight to the authorities. But I didn't. Instead, I looked around, searching for more footprints, more signs of who had been here. And then I saw it. A little further ahead, half hidden by the underbrush, was something large and dark. Tarp. Blue, dirty, weighed down by rocks at the edges. I knew, even before I got closer, I knew what I was going to find. But I walked forward anyway. I reached the tarp and hesitated. My breathing was too loud in the silence. My hands shook as I reached down and pulled back the edge. Underneath was a man. His face was pale, his eyes half open, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. His clothes were torn, stained with dried blood. He'd been dead for at least a day, maybe more. I stumbled back, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. My first instinct was to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I just stood there, staring down at him, my mind racing. Who was he? What happened to him? And more importantly, where was the person who had left him here? Then I heard it, a twig snapping. Not far away. Someone was out there. Someone who had been close enough to hear me, maybe even see me. I turned and ran. Branches tore at my skin. Roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs ached, until I was back on the trail. And then I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I threw the door open, jumped inside, and locked it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the keys into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I slammed it into reverse, kicking up dirt as I sped out of there. I didn't call the cops right away. I should have, but I was too scared, too shaken. It wasn't until I was halfway home, my hands still gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white, that I finally pulled over and dialed 911. They found the body. The man had been missing for 2 days. A hiker just like me. He'd been attacked, left for dead. They never found who did it. I haven't gone hiking since. I parked my truck at the trailhead just before sunrise. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. I had planned this solo hike for months, studying maps, reading trip reports, making sure I knew what I was getting into. This was a remote area, a 12-mile loop through dense forest, along a river, and up to a ridge with a sweeping view of the valley below. It wasn't a heavily trafficked trail, which was exactly why I chose it. The first few miles were peaceful. Birds were waking up, chirping in the trees. The sun rose slowly, casting golden light through the branches. The forest felt alive but calm. My boots crunched on the dirt, and the weight of my pack settled comfortably on my shoulders. I took my time, stopping occasionally to take a sip of water or adjust my gear. About 4 miles in, I reached the river. The water was moving fast, swollen from recent rain. The bridge was just a simple wooden footbridge, no handrails, just logs and planks nailed together. It looked solid enough. I stepped onto it, feeling the wood creak slightly under my weight, and made my way across. The sound of rushing water was loud, but I liked it. It drowned out everything else. I paused in the middle to look down at the water, dark, churning, full of hidden currents. On the other side, the trail narrowed and climbed steeply. I focused on my breathing, on the rhythm of my steps. The trees grew denser, the canopy blocking out more of the sunlight. It was darker here, quieter. The air felt different. Not bad, just different. Around the 6-mile mark, I stopped for lunch at a small clearing. I sat on a fallen log, pulled out a sandwich, and took my time eating. I was making good progress. If I kept up my pace, I'd be back at my truck before dark. I checked my map, my compass. Everything was going according to plan. Then, as I packed up, I noticed something. A boot print in the dirt. Fresh. But that wasn't what made me pause. What bothered me was the size. It was huge. Bigger than any footprint I had ever seen. The edges were sharp, crisp. Whoever left it had passed through recently. And yet, I hadn't seen or heard anyone. I stood there for a long moment, listening. Nothing. Just the wind in the trees. I shook it off and kept moving. The next few miles were uneventful, but that feeling never really went away. I kept glancing over my shoulder, listening for anything unusual. I told myself it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me. At mile 9, the trail split. One path continued up toward the ridge. The other veered down into a small valley. My route took me up. As I climbed, the forest thinned out, opening to rocky outcroppings and patches of scrub. The higher I went, the better the view got. When I finally reached the top, I stopped to take it in. Mountains stretched in every direction. The river snaked through the valley below, glinting in the afternoon sun. It was beautiful, peaceful. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Far below, near the river where I had been earlier, someone was standing on the trail. A dark figure, motionless. From this distance, I couldn't make out any details, but they were facing my direction. Just standing there, watching. I blinked, looked again. The figure was gone. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow. But deep down, I knew better. I started moving again, faster now. I wanted to get back to my truck, back to safety. The descent was steep, the trail rocky and uneven. I forced myself to focus, to stay steady. My heart was pounding, but I kept telling myself I was fine. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy. Close. I stopped. The sound stopped. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. I started walking again. So did the footsteps. Panic surged through me. I picked up my pace, practically jogging now. My pack bounced against my back. The sun was lower, shadows growing longer. I needed to get out of here. With 3 miles to go, I reached the river again. I ran across the bridge, barely touching the wood. Once on the other side, I forced myself to slow down, to breathe. The trailhead wasn't far now. Then, just as I rounded a bend, I saw it. Another footprint, the same size as before, but this time it was right in the middle of the trail. Fresh. My blood turned to ice. Someone had been here. Someone was following me. I didn't stop. Couldn't. I pushed forward, moving as fast as I could without running. My muscles burned. My lungs ached. But I didn't care. I just needed to get to my truck. Finally, I saw it. The trailhead. My truck. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't slow down. I practically threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. Then, just as I was about to pull away, I saw movement in my rearview mirror. A figure stepping out of the trees. Tall, broad, watching me. I didn't wait. I hit the gas and sped down the dirt road, not looking back. My hands were shaking. My heart was hammering. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, surrounded by other cars, other people. I never found out who or what was out there, but I never hiked that trail again. I had been planning the hike for months. It was supposed to be a simple solo trip, 2 days out, 2 days back. The route took me through some of the most remote and rugged parts of the national forest, places where cell service was non-existent, and the only sounds were the wind, the birds, and my own footsteps crunching over dirt and dead leaves. The first day went as expected. The weather was perfect, clear sky, mild temperatures. I had packed light but smart. A tent, sleeping bag, a good knife, water filter, and enough food to last me the trip. I made good time, covering nearly 15 miles before setting up camp just before dusk. The second day, things started to shift. The terrain became steeper, rougher. My legs burned with every step as I climbed up switchbacks and crossed shallow creeks. I had studied the map thoroughly, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia. I knew what that felt like. This was different. Every so often, I'd hear a rustle in the trees behind me. Not the quick, nervous movement of a deer or squirrel, but something slower, deliberate. I would stop, turn, listen, nothing. Just the wind and the stillness of the forest. I pushed on. By late afternoon, I reached a narrow valley where the map showed an old logging road. I figured I'd camp nearby, get a fresh start in the morning. But the feeling of being watched hadn't left. If anything, it had grown stronger. The air felt heavy. I picked a spot near a cluster of thick pines and set up my tent. As I cooked dinner, the unease settled in my stomach like a knot. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects, just silence. I slept lightly. Every few hours, I'd wake up, listen, then drift back to sleep. Around 3 a.m., I heard something. A snap, a branch breaking. I held my breath. It was close, too close. My fingers closed around the knife at my side. I stayed still, listening, trying to control my breathing. Another sound, soft, deliberate footsteps circling my tent. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? No, a bear would be louder, less cautious. A mountain lion? Maybe, but I'd never heard of one stalking a tent like this. Human? The thought made my skin crawl. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. The air was so thick with silence it almost rang in my ears. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, gripping the knife, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then, nothing. Just silence again. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first light filtered through the trees, I packed up and moved. I didn't eat, didn't rest, I just walked. I didn't care if I was going off schedule. Something was wrong and I needed to get out of there. By midday, I reached a ridge that overlooked the valley. I stopped to catch my breath and looked back. The forest stretched endlessly behind me. I saw nothing, but I knew something had been there, watching. The rest of the hike was a blur. I moved fast, barely stopping to eat or drink. Every so often, I'd hear a sound behind me. Faint, distant, but there. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted, my body running on pure adrenaline. I threw my pack in the back seat and locked the doors before I even started the engine. I drove for miles before I pulled over. My hands were shaking. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the isolation get to me. But deep down, I knew better. I've hiked all my life. I know what the woods feel like, how they sound. That silence, that presence, it wasn't normal. I haven't been back since.